Blackstone Audiobooks presents Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer Among the Indians by Mark Twain and Lee Nelson. Chapter 1. That other book which I made before was named Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Maybe you remember about it, but if you don't, it don't make no difference because it ain't got nothing to do with this one. The way it ended up was that me and Tom Sawyer and the nigger Jim that used to belong to old Miss Watson was away down in Arkansas at Tom's Aunt Sally's and Uncle Silas's. Jim warn't a slave no more, but free, but never mind about that. How he become to get free and who done it and what a power of work and danger it was is all told about in that other book. Well then, pretty soon it got dull there on that little plantation, and Tom he got pizened with the notion of going amongst the Injuns for a while, to see how it would be. But about that time Aunt Sally took us off up home to Missouri, and then right away after that she went away across the state, nearly to the west border, to stay a month or 2 months with some of her relations on a hemp farm out there, and took Tom and Sid and Mary. And I went along because Tom wanted me to, and Jim went too because there was white men around our little town that was plenty mean enough and ornery enough to steal Jim's papers from him and sell him down the river again. But they couldn't come and do that if he stayed with us. Well, there's liver places in a hemp farm, there ain't no use to deny it, and some people don't take to them. Pretty soon, sure enough, just as I expected, Tom he begun to get in a sweat to have something going on. Somehow Tom Sawyer couldn't ever stand much lazying around. Though as for me, betwixt lazying around and pie, I hadn't no choice, and wouldn't know which to take, and just as soon have them both as not, and druther. So he rousted out his Injun notion again and was dead set on having us run off some night and cut for the Injun country and go for adventures. He said it was getting too dull on the hemp farm, it'd give him the fan-tods. But me and Jim kind of hung fire. Plenty to eat and nothing to do. We was very well satisfied. We had never had such comfortable times before, and we reckoned we better let it alone as long as Providence warn't noticing. It would get busted up soon enough, likely, without our putting in and helping. But Tom, he stuck to the thing and pegged at us every day. Jim says, "I don't see the use, Mars Tom. Fur as I can see, people that has Injuns on their hands ain't no better off than people that ain't got no Injuns. Well, then, we ain't got no Injuns, we don't need no Injuns, and what does we want to go and hunt 'em up for? We getting along just as well as if we had 1,000,000 on 'em. They's a powerful ornery lot anyway." "Who is?" "Why, the Injuns." "Who says so?" "What do you know about it?" "What does I know about it? I knows this much. If they catches a body out, they'll take and skin him same as they would a dog. That's what I knows about 'em." "All falderole. Who told you that?" "Well, I hear old Missus say so." "Old Missus, the widow Douglas? Much she knows about it. Has she ever been skinned?" "Course not." "Just as I expected. She don't know what she's talking about. Has she ever been amongst the Injuns?" "No." "Well, then, what right has she got to be blackguarding them and telling what ain't so about them?" "Well, anyway, old General Gaines, he's been amongst 'em anyway." "All right, so he has. Been with 'em lots of times, hasn't he?" "Yes, lots of times." "Been with 'em years, hasn't he?" "Yes, sir. Why, Mars Tom, he—" "Very well, then. Has he been skinned? You answer me that." Jim see Tom had him. He couldn't say a word. Tom Sawyer was the keenest boy for laying for a person and just leading him along by the nose without ever seeming to do it till he got him where he couldn't budge and then bust his arguments all to flinders I ever see. It warn't no use to argue with Tom Sawyer. A body never stood any show. Jim he hemmed and hawed, but all he could say was that he had somehow got the notion that Injuns was powerful ornery, but he reckoned maybe— Then Tom shut him off. "You reckon maybe you've been mistaken. Well, you have. Injuns ornery? It's the most ignorant idea that ever— Why, Jim, they're the noblest human beings that's ever been in the world. If a white man tells you a thing, do you know it's true? No, you don't, because generally it's a lie. But if an Injun tells you a thing, you can bet on it every time for the petrified fact, because you can't get an Injun to lie. He would cut his tongue out first. If you trust to a white man's honor, you better look out. But you trust to an Injun's honor, and nothing in the world can make him betray you. He would die first and be glad to. An Injun is all honor. That's what they're made of. You ask a white man to divide his property with you, will he do it? I think I see him at it, but you go to an Injun and he'll give you everything he's got in the world. It's just the difference between an Injun and a white man. They're just all generousness and unstingeableness. And brave? Why, they ain't afraid of anything. If there was just one Injun and a whole regiment of white men against him, they wouldn't stand the least show in the world, not the least. You'd see that splendid, gigantic Injun come war-whooping down on his wild charger all over paint and feathers, waving his tomahawk and letting drive with his bow faster than anybody could count the arrows, and hitting a soldier in any part of his body he wanted to, every time, any distance. And in 2 minutes, you'd see him santering off with a wheelbarrow load of scalps and the rest of them stampeding for the United States the same as if the menagerie was after them. Death? An Injun don't care shucks for death. They prefer it. They sing when they're dying, sing their death song. You take an Injun and stick him full of arrows and splinters, and hack him up with a hatchet and skin him and start a slow fire under him, and do you reckon he minds it? No, sir. He will just sit there in the hot ashes perfectly comfortable and sing, same as if he was on salary. Would a white man? You know he wouldn't. And they're the most gigantic, magnificent creatures in the whole world, and can knock a man down with a barrel of flour as far as they can see him. They're awful strong and fiery and eloquent, and wear beautiful blankets and war paint and moccasins, and the buckskin clothes all over beads, and go fighting and scalping every day in the year but Sundays, and have a noble good time. And they love friendly white men, and just dote on them, and can't do too much for them, and would rather die than let any harm come to them. And they think just as much of niggers as they do of anybody. And the young squaws are the most beautiful maidens that was ever in the whole world. And they love a white hunter the minute their eye falls on him. And from that minute, nothing can ever shake their love loose again, and they're always on the watch out to protect him from danger and get themselves killed in the place of him. Look at Pocahontas. And an Injun can see as far as a telescope with the naked eye, and an enemy can't slip around anywhere, even in the dark, but he knows it. And if he sees one single blade of grass bent down, it's all he wants. He knows which way to go to find the enemy that done it. And he can read all kinds of trifling little signs just the same way with his eagle eye, which you would never see at all. And if he sees a little whiff of smoke going up in the air 35 miles off, he knows in a second if it's a friend's campfire or an enemy's, just by the smell of the smoke. Because they're the most giftedest people in the whole world, and the hospitablest and the happiest, and don't ever have anything to do from year's end to year's end but have a perfectly supernatural good time and piles of adventures. Amongst the Injuns, life is just simply a circus, that's what it is. Anybody that knows will tell you can't praise it too high and you can't put it too strong. Jim's eyes was shining, and so was mine, I reckon, and he was excited, and it was the same with both of us as far as that was concerned. Jim drawed a long breath and then says, "Whoosh, them's the ticket for Jim. Bust if it don't beat all how rotten ignorant a body can be about Injuns when he ain't had no chance to study 'em up. Why, Marse Tom, if I'd knowed what Injuns really is, I pledges you my word well, you just count me in, that's all. Count me in on the Injun country business. I's ready to go. I don't want no likelier folks around me than what them Injuns is. And Huck's ready too, ain't it so, Huck?" Course, I weren't going to stay behind if they went, so I said I was. Chapter 2. So we went to making preparations, and mighty private and secret too, because Tom Sawyer wouldn't have nothing to do with the thing if there weren't no mystery about it. About 3 mile out in the woods, amongst the hills, there was an old tumble-down log house that used to be lived in, some time or other when people cut timber there. And we found it on a coon hunt one night, but nobody ever went there now. So we let on it was infested with pirates and robbers, and we laid in the woods all one rainy night, perfectly still, and not showing fire or a light. And just before dawn we crept up pretty close and then sprung out whooping and yelling, and took it by surprise, and never lost a man, Tom said, and was awful proud of it, though I couldn't see no sense in all that trouble and bother because we could have took it in the daytime just as well. There weren't nobody there. Tom called the place a cavern, though it warn't a cavern at all. It was a house, and a mighty ornery house at that. Every day we went up to the little town that was 2 mile from the farm and bought things for the outfit and to barter with the Injuns, skillets and coffee pots and tin cups and blankets, and 3 sacks of flour and bacon and sugar and coffee and fish hooks and pipes and tobacco and ammunition and pistols and 3 guns and glass beads and all such things. And we hid 'em in the woods, and nights we clumb out of the window and slid down the lightning rod and went and got the things and took them to the cavern. There was an old Mexican on the next farm below ours, and we got him to learn us how to pack a pack mule so we could do it first rate. And last of all, we went down 15 or 20 miles further and bought 5 good mules and saddles because we didn't want to raise no suspicions around home, and took the mules to the cavern in the night and picketed them in the grass. There warn't no better mules in the state of Missouri, Tom said, and so did Jim. Our idea was to have a time amongst the Injuns for a couple of months or so, but we had stuff enough to last longer than that, I reckon, because Tom allowed we ought to be fixed for accidents. Tom bought a considerable lot of little odds and ends of one kind and another, which it ain't worthwhile to name, which he said would come good with the Injuns. Well, the last day that we went up to town, we laid in an almanac and a flask or two of liquor, and struck a stranger that had a curiosity and was peddling it. It was little sticks about as long as my finger with some stuff like yellow wax on the ends, and all you had to do was rake the yellow end on something, and the stick would catch fire and smell like all possessed on account of part of it being brimstone. We had never heard anything like that before. They were the convenientest things in the world and just the trick for us to have. So Tom bought a lot of them. The man called them lucifer matches, and said anybody could make them that had brimstone and phosphorus to do it with. So he sold Tom a passel of brimstone and phosphorus, and we allowed to make some for ourselves sometime or other. We was all ready now, so we waited for full moon, which would be in 2 or 3 days. Tom wrote a letter to his Aunt Polly to leave behind, telling her goodbye and saying rest easy and not worry, because we would be back in 2 or 3 weeks, but not telling her anything about where we was gone. And then, Thursday night, when it was about 11 and everything still, we got up and dressed and slid down the lightning rod and shoved the letter under the front door and slid by the nigger quarters and give a low whistle, and Jim come gliding out, and we struck out for the cavern and packed everything onto 2 of the mules and put on our belts and pistols and bowie knives and saddled up the 3 other mules and rode out into the big moonlight and started west. By and by, we struck level country and a pretty smooth path, and not so much woods, and the moonlight was perfectly splendid, and so was the stillness. You couldn't hear nothing but the creaking of the saddles. After a while, there was that cool and fresh feeling that tells you day is coming, and then the sun come up behind us and made the leaves and grass and flowers shine and sparkle on account of the dew, and the birds let go and begun to sing like everything. So then we took to the woods and made camp and picketed the mules and laid off and slept a good deal of the day. 3 more nights we traveled that way and laid up daytimes, and everything was mighty pleasant. We never run across anybody and hardly ever see a light. After that we judged we was so far from home that we was safe. So then we begun to travel by daylight. The second day after that, when we was hoping to begin to see Injun signs, we struck a wagon road. And at the same time we struck an emigrant wagon with a family aboard, and it was near sundown, and they asked us to camp with them, and we done it. There was a man about 55 and his wife, named Mills, and 3 big sons, Buck and Bill and Sam, and a girl that said she was 17 named Peggy, and her little sister Flaxie, 7-year-old. They was from down in the lower end of Missouri, and they was bound for Oregon, going to settle there. We said we was bound for Injun country, and they said they was going to pass through it, and we could join company with them if we would like to. They was the simple-heartedest, good-naturedest country folks in the world, and didn't know anything, hardly. I mean, what you call learnin'. Except Peggy. She had read considerable many books, and knowed as much as most any girl, and was just as pretty as ever she could be and live. But she warn't no prettier than she was good, and all the tribe doted on her. Why, they took as much care of her as if she was made out of sugar or gold or something. When she'd come to the campfire, any of her brothers would get up in a minute and give her the best place. I reckon you don't see that kind of brothers pretty often. She didn't have to saddle her own mule the way she'd have to do in most society. They always done it for her. Her and her mother never had anything to do but cook, that is all. The brothers got the wood, they built the fires, they skinned the game, and whenever they had time they helped her wash up the things. It ain't often you see a brother kiss his own sister. Fact is, I don't know as I'd ever seen such a thing before. But they done it. I know because I seen them do it myself, and not just once but plenty of times. Tom see it too, and so did Jim. And they never said a cross word to her, not one. They called her dear. Plenty of times they called her that, and right before company too. They didn't care. They never thought nothing of it. And she didn't either. They'd say "Peggy dear" to her just in the naturalest, off-handedest way. It didn't make no difference who was around. And it took me 2 or 3 days to get so I could keep from blushing. I was so ashamed for them, though I knowed it weren't the least harm, because they was right out of the woods and didn't know no better. But I don't wish to seem to be picking flaws in them and abusing them, because I don't. They was the splendidest people in the world, and after you got that fact stowed in your mind solid, you was very well satisfied and perfectly willing to overlook their manners, because nobody can't be perfect anyway. We all got to be uncommon friendly together. It warn't any trouble at all. We traveled with them and camped with them every night. Buck and Bill and Sam was wonderful with a lasso or a gun or a pistol or horseback riding, and they learned us all these things, so we got to be powerful good at them, especially Tom. And though he couldn't throw a lasso as far as a man could, he could throw it about as true. And he could cave in a squirrel's or a wild turkey's or a prairie chicken's head any fair distance, and could send both loads from his pistol through your hat on a fun gallop at 20 yards if you wanted him to. There weren't ever any better people than the Millses. But Peggy, she was the cap sheaf of the lot, of course. So gentle she was, and so sweet. And whenever you'd done a little thing for her, it made you feel so kind of all over comfortable and blessed to see her smile. If you ever felt cut about anything, she never asked about the rights of it or who done it, but just went to work and never rested till she had coaxed the smart all out and made you forget all about it. And she was that kind of a girl that if you ever made a mistake and happened to say something that hurt her, the minute you saw by her face what you had done, you wanted to get down on your knees in the dirt, you felt so mean and sorry. You couldn't ever get tired looking at her all day long, she was so dear and pretty. And mornings it warn't ever sun-up to me till she come out. One day, about a couple of weeks after we had left the United States behind and was ever so far away out on the Great Plains, we struck the Platte River and went into camp in a nice grassy place a couple of hours before sundown, and there we run across a camp of Injuns, the first ones we'd been close enough to yet to get acquainted with. Tom was powerful glad. Chapter 3. It was just the place for a camp, the likeliest we had found yet. Big stream of water and considerable many trees along it. The rest of the country, as far as you could see, any which way you looked, clear to where the sky touched the earth, was just long levels and low waves, like what I reckon the ocean would be if the ocean was made out of grass. Away off, miles and miles, was one tree standing by itself, and away off the other way was another, and here and yonder another and another scattered around. The air was so clear you would think they was close by, but they warn't so. Most of them was miles away. Old Mills said he would stop there and rest up the animals. I happened to be looking at Peggy just then, because I mostly always happened to be looking at her when she was around, and her cheeks turned faint red and beautiful, like a nigger's does when he puts a candle in his mouth to surprise a child. She never said nothing, but pretty soon she got to singing low to herself and looking happy. I didn't let on, but next morning when I see her slip off to the top of one of them grass waves and stand shading her eyes with her hands and looking away off over the country, I went there and got it all out of her. And it warn't no trouble either, after she got started. It looked like the mainest trouble was going to be to stop her again. She had a sweetheart. That was what was the matter of her. He had stayed behind to finish up things and would be along when he got done. His name was Brace Johnson. Big and fine and brave and good and splendid and all that. As near as I could make out, 26 years old. Been amongst the Injuns ever since he was a boy, trapping, hunting, scouting, fighting, knowed all about Injuns, knowed some of the languages, knowed the plains and the mountains and all that whole country from Texas to Oregon. And now he was done with all that kind of life, and her and him was going to settle down in Oregon and get married and go to farming it. I reckon she thought she only loved him, but I see by her talk it was upwards of that. She worshipped him. She said we was to stay where we was till he come, which might be in a week, and then we would stay as much longer as her pap thought the horses needed to. There was 5 of the Injuns, and they had spry little ponies and was camped tolerable close by. They was big, strong, grand-looking fellows, and had on buckskin leggins and moccasins and red feathers in their hair and knives and tomahawks and bows and arrows. And one of them had an old gun and could talk a little English, but it warn't any use to him. He couldn't kill anything with it because it hadn't any flint. I mean the gun. They was naked from the waist up when they hadn't on their blankets. They sat around our fire till bedtime the first night and took supper with us and passed around the pipe and was very friendly and made signs to us and grunted back when we signed anything they understood. And pretty much anything they see that they liked, they wanted it. So they got coffee, sugar, and tobacco, and a lot of little things. They was there to breakfast next morning, and then me and Tom went over to their camp with them, and we all shot at a mark with their bows and arrows, and they could outshoot anything I ever see with a bow and arrow, and could stand off a good ways and hit a tree with a tomahawk every time. They come back with us at noon and ate dinner, and the one with the gun showed it to Peggy and made signs would she give him a flint, and she got one from her father and put it in the gun lock and fixed it herself, and the Injun was very thankful and called her good squaw and pretty squaw, and she was ever so pleased. And another one named Hogface that had a bad old hurt on his shin, she bandaged it up and put salve on it, and he was very thankful too. Tom said he was just wild over the Injuns and said there warn't no white men so noble. And he warn't by himself in it, because me and Jim and all the rest of us got right down fond of them. And Peggy said she did wish Brace was here. He would change his notions about Injuns, which he was down on and hated them like snakes and always said he wouldn't trust one anyhow or anywhere, in peacetime or wartime or any other time. She showed me a little dirk knife, which she got out of her bosom, and asked me what I reckoned it was for and who give it to her. I don't know, I says. Who did give it to you? Brace? Then she laughed, gay and happy, and says, You'll never guess what it's for. Well, what is it for? Says I. To kill myself with. Oh, good land, I says. How you talk? Yes, she says, it's the truth. Brace told me that if I ever fell into the hands of the savages, I mustn't stop to think about him or the family or anything, or wait an hour to see if I mightn't be rescued. I mustn't waste any time. I mustn't take any chances. I must kill myself right away. Goodness, I says, and for why? Of course, I teased him to tell me, but he wouldn't. He kept trying to get me to promise, but I laughed him off every time and told him if he was so anxious to get rid of me, he must tell me why I must kill myself, and then maybe I would promise. At last he said he couldn't tell me, so I said very well then I wouldn't promise, and laughed again, but he didn't laugh. By and by he said, very serious and troubled, You know I wouldn't ask you to do that or any other thing that wasn't the best for you. You can trust me for that, can't you? That made me serious, too, because that was true. But I couldn't promise such a thing, you know. It made me just shudder to think of it. So then he asked me if I would keep the dirk as his gift and keepsake, and when I said I would, he said that would do, was all he wanted. One of the Injuns, named Blue Fox, come up just then, and the minute he see the little dirk, he begun to beg for it. It was their style. They begged for everything that come in their way. But Peggy wouldn't let him have it. Next day and the next he come teasing around her, wanting to take it to his camp and make a nice new sheath and a belt for her to wear it in. And so she got tired at last, and he took it away. But she never let him have it till he promised he would take good care of it and never let it get out of his hands. He was that pleased that he up and gave her a necklace made out of bear's claws. And as she had to give him something back, of course, she gave him a Bible and tried to learn him some religion, but he couldn't understand, and so it didn't do him no particular good. That is, it didn't just then, but it did after a little, because when the Injuns go to gambling, same as they done every day, he put up his Bible against a tomahawk and won it. They was a sociable lot. They wrastled with Buck and Bill and Sam and learned them some new holts and throws that they didn't know before, and we all run foot races and horse races with them, and it was prime to see the way their ornery little ponies would split along when their pluck was up. And they danced dances for us. 2 or 3 times they put on all their fuss and feathers and war paint and danced the war dance and whooped and jumped and howled and yelled, and it was lovely and horrible. But the one with the gun, named Man Afraid of His Mother-in-Law, didn't ever put on any paint and finery and didn't dance in the war dances, and mostly he didn't come around when they had them, and when he did he looked sour and glum and didn't stay. Yes, we was all stuck after the Injuns, kind of in love with them, as you may say, and I reckon I never had better times than I had then. Peggy was as good to them as if she was their sister or their child, and they was very fond of her. She was sorry for the one with the gun and tried to encourage him to put on his war paint and dance the war dance with the others and be happy and not glum. And it pleased him to have her be so friendly, but he never done it. Pretty soon it struck her what maybe the matter was, and she says to me, "He's in mourning, that's what it is. He has lost a friend. And to think here I've been hurting him and making him remember his sorrows when I wouldn't have done such a thing for the whole world if I had known. So after that she couldn't do too much for him, nor be sorry enough for him, and she wished more than ever that Brace was here so he could see that Injuns was just like other people after all, and had their sorrows and troubles, and knowed how to love a friend and grieve for him when he was gone. Tom, he was set on having the Injuns take me and him and Jim into their band and let us travel to their country and live in their tribe a week or two. And so on the 4th day we went over to their camp, me and Tom did, to ask them. But they was fixin' for a buffalo hunt next mornin', to be gone all day and maybe longer, and that filled Tom so full of excitement he couldn't think about anything else, for we hadn't ever seen a buffalo yet. They had a plan for me and Jim and Tom to start before daylight with one Injun and go in one direction, and Buck in another with another Injun, and Bill with another, and Sam with another, and leave the other Injun in their camp because he was so lame with his sore leg, and whichever gang found the buffaloes first was to signal the other. So it was all fixed. Then we see Peggy off there on one of them grass waves with Flaxie, looking out over the country with her hand over her eyes, and all the Injuns noticed her at once and asked us what she was looking for. I said she was expecting a lot of friends. The Injun that spoke a little English asked me how many. It's always my disposition to stretch, so I said 7. Tom, he kind of smiled, but let it go at that. Man afraid of his mother-in-law says, "Little child," meaning Flaxie, you know, "say only 1. I see I was catched, but in my opinion a body don't ever gain anything by weakening in them circumstances, so I says 7, and said it firm and stuck to it. The Injuns talked amongst themselves a while, then they told us to go over and ask Bill and Buck and Sam to come and talk about the hunt. We done it, and they went over, and we all sat down to wait supper till they come back. They said they reckoned they would be back inside of half an hour. In a little while 4 of the Injuns come and said the boys was staying behind to eat supper with Hogface in their camp. So then we asked the Injuns to eat supper with us, and Peggy, she passed around the tin plates and things and dished out the victuals, and we all begun. They had put their war paint and feathers and fixin's on since we left their camp, all but the one with the gun, so I judged we would have another good time. We ate and talked and laughed, till by and by we was all done, and then still we sat there talking. By and by Tom shoved his elbow into my side, soft and easy, and then got up and took a bucket and said he would fetch some water for Peggy and went santering off. I said I would help, so I got a bucket and followed along. As soon as we was behind some trees, Tom says, "Somehow everything don't seem right, Huck. They don't smoke. They've always smoked before. There's only one gun outside the wagon, and a minute or two ago one of them was meddling with it. I never thought anything of it at the time, but I do now, because I happened to notice it just a minute ago, and by George, the flint's gone. There's something up, Huck. I'm going to fetch the boys." Away he went, and what to do I didn't know. I started back, keeping behind the trees, and when I got pretty close I judged I would watch what was going on and wait for Tom and the boys. The Injuns was up and sidling around, the rest was chatting, same as before, and Peggy was gathering up the plates and things. I heard a trampling like a lot of horses, and when it got pretty near I see that other Injun coming on a pony, and driving the other ponies and all our mules and horses ahead of him, and he let off a long, wild whoop, and the minute he done that, the Injun that had a gun, the one that Peggy fixed, shot her father through the head with it and scalped him. Another one tomahawked her mother and scalped her, and then these 2 grappled Jim and tied his hands together, and the other 2 grabbed Peggy, who was screaming and crying, and all of them rushed off with her and Jim and Flaxie. And as fast as I could run and as far as I could run, I could still hear her, till I was a long, long ways off. Soon it got dark, and I had to stop, I was so tired. It was an awful long night, and I didn't sleep, but was watching and listening all the time, and scared at every little sound, and miserable. I never see such a night for hanging on and stringing out and dismalness. When daylight come, I didn't dast to stir at first, being afraid. But I got so hungry I had to, and besides I wanted to find out about Tom. So I went sneaking for the camp, which was a way off across the country. I could tell it by the trees. I struck the line of trees as far up as I could and slipped along down behind them. There was a smoke, but by and by I see it warn't the campfire, it was the wagon. The Injuns had robbed it and burned it. When I got down pretty close, I see Tom there, walking around and looking. I was desperate glad, for I didn't know but the other Injun had got him. We scratched around for something to eat but didn't find it, everything being burnt. Then we sat down and I told Tom everything and he told me everything. He said when he got to the Injun camp, the first thing he see was Buck and Sam and Bill laying dead, tomahawked and scalped and stripped. And each of them had as much as 25 arrows sticking in him. And he told me how else they had served the bodies, which was horrible, but it would not do to put it in a book. Of course, the boys' knives and pistols was gone. Then Tom and me sat there a considerable time with our jaws in our hands, thinking and not saying anything. At last I says, "Well?" He didn't answer right off, but pretty soon he says, "I've thought it out and my mind's made up, but I'll give you the first say if you want it." I says, "No, I don't want it. I've tried, but I can't seem to strike any plan. We're here and that's all there is to it. We're here as much as 1,000,000 miles from any place, I reckon, and we haven't got anywhere but just to hoof it, and I reckon we'd play out and die before we got there that way. We're in a fix. That's all I know about it. We're just in a fix, and you can't call it by no lighter name. Whatever your plan is, it'll suit me. I'll do whatever you say. Go on, talk." Chapter 4. So he says, "Well, this is my idea, Huck. I got Jim into this scrape, and so of course I ain't going to turn back towards home till I've got him out of it again, or found out he's dead. But you ain't in fault like me, and so if we can run across any trappers bound for the States—" "Never mind about that, Tom," I says. "I'm a-going with you. I want to help save Jim if I can, and I want to help save Peggy, too. She was good to us, and I couldn't rest easy if I didn't. I'll go with you, Tom." "All right," he says. "I hoped you would, and I was certain you would, but I didn't want to cramp you or influence you." "But how are we going?" I says. "Walk?" "No," he says. "Have you forgot about Brace Johnson?" I had, and it made the cold misery go through me to hear his name, for it was going to be sorrowful times for him when he come. So we was to wait there for him, and maybe 2 or 3 days without anything to eat, because the folks warn't expecting him for about a week from the time we camped. We went off a half a mile to the highest of them grass waves, where there was a small tree, and took a long look over the country to see if we could see Brace or anybody coming, but there wasn't a living thing stirring anywhere. It was the biggest, widest, levelest world, and all dead, dead and still, not a sound. The lonesomest place that ever was, enough to break a body's heart just to listen to the awful stillness of it. We talked a little sometimes, once an hour maybe, but mostly we took up the time thinking and looking because it was hard to talk against such solemnness. Once I said, "Tom, where did you learn about Injuns, how noble they was and all that?" He gave me a look that showed me I'd hit him hard, very hard, and so I wished I hadn't said the words. He turned away his head, and after a minute he said, "Cooper's novels," and didn't say anything more, and I didn't say anything more, and so that changed the subject. I see he didn't want to talk about it and was feeling bad, so I just let it rest there, not ever having any disposition to fret or worry any person. We had started a campfire in a new place further along down the stream, with fire from the burnt wagon, because the Injuns had burnt the bodies of old Mr. Mills and his wife along with the wagon, and so that place seemed a kind of graveyard, you know, and we didn't like to stay about it. We went to the new fire once in a while and kept it going, and we slept there that night, most starved. We turned out at dawn, and I jumped up brash and gay, for I'd been dreaming I was home. But I just looked around once over that 1,000,000 miles of gray dead level, and my soul sucked back that brashness and gayness again with just one suck, like a sponge. And then all the miserableness come back and was worse than yesterday. Just as it got to be light, we see some creatures away off on the prairie, going like the wind, and reckoned they was antelopes or Injuns, or both, but didn't know. But it was good to see some life again anyway. It didn't seem so lonesome after that for a while. We was so hungry we couldn't stay still, so we went loafing off and run across a prairie dog village, little low mounds with holes in them, and a sentinel, which was a prairie dog, and looked like a Norway rat standing guard. We had long cottonwood sticks along, which we had cut off of the trees and was eating the bark for breakfast. And we dug into the village and rousted out an owl or two and a couple of handfuls of rattlesnakes, and hoped we was going to get a dog, but didn't, nor an owl either. But we hived as bully a rattlesnake as ever I see, and took him to camp and cut his head off and skinned him and roasted him in the hot embers, and he was prime. But Tom was afraid and wouldn't eat any at first, But I knowed they was all right because I'd seen hogs and niggers eat them, and it warn't no time to be proud when you are starving to death, I reckoned. Well, it made us feel a powerful sight better, and nearly cheerful again. And when we got done, we had snake enough left for a Sunday school blowout, for he was a noble big one. He was middlin' dry, but if we'd had some gravy or butter or something, it wouldn't have been any slouch of a picnic. We put in the third day that we was alone talking and laying around and wandering about and snaking, and found it more and more lonesomer and drearier than ever. Often as we come to a high grass wave, we went up and looked out over the country, but all we ever saw was buzzards or ravens or something wheeling round and round over where the Injun camp was, and knowed what brought them there. We hadn't been there and hadn't been even near there. When we was coming home towards evening with a pretty likely snake, we stopped and took another long look across country and didn't see anything at first, but pretty soon we thought we did. But it was away off yonder against the sky ever so far, and so we warn't certain. You can see an awful distance there, the air is so clear, so we calculated to have to wait a good while, and we did. In about a half an hour, I reckon, we could make out that it was horses or men or something and coming our way. Then we laid down and kept close, because it might be Injuns, and we didn't want no more Injun then, far from it. At last Tom says, "There's 3 horses, sure." And pretty soon he says, "There is only one man. He's driving 3 pack mules ahead of him, and coming along mighty brisk. He's got a wide slouch hat on, and I reckon he's white. It's Brace Johnson, I guess. I reckon he's the only person expected this year. Come, let's creep along behind the grass waves and get nearer. If it's him, we want to stop him before he gets to the old camp and break it to him easy." But we couldn't. He was too fast for us. There he sat on his horse, staring. The minute we showed ourselves, he had his gun leveled on us. Then he noticed we warn't Injuns and dropped it and told us to come on, and we did. "Boys," he says, "by the odds and ends that's left, I see that this was the Millses' camp. Was you with them?" "Yes." "What happened?" I never said nothing, and Tom, he didn't at first. Then he said, "Injuns." "Yes," he says, "I see that myself by the signs. But the folks got away, didn't they?" We didn't answer. He jumped off of his horse and come up to us quick, looking anxious, and says, "Where are they? Quick, where are they? Where's Peggy?" Well, we had to tell him. There warn't no other way, and it was all he could do to stand it. Just all he could do. And when we come to tell about Peggy, he couldn't stand it. His face turned as white as milk, and the tears run down his cheeks, and he kept saying, "Oh, my God, oh, my God." It was so dreadful to see him that I wanted to get him away from that part of it, and so I worked around and got back onto the other details and says, "The one with the gun that didn't have no war paint, he shot Mr. Mills and scalped him. And he bloodied his hands then and made blood stripes across his face with his fingers like war paint, and then begun to howl war whoops like the Injuns does in the circus. And poor old Mrs. Mills, she was down on her knees begging so pitiful when the tomahawk— I shall never, never see her again. Never, never any more, my poor little darling. So young and sweet and beautiful, but thank God she's dead." He warn't listening to me. "Dead?" I says. "If you mean Peggy, she's not dead." He whirls on me like a wildcat and shouts, "Not dead? Take it back, or I'll strangle you. How do you know?" His fingers was working, and so I stepped back a little out of reach, and then says, "I know she ain't because I see the Injuns drag her away, and they didn't strike her nor offer to hurt her." Well, he only just groaned and waved out his hands and fetched them together on top of his head. Then he says, "You staggered me, and for a minute I believed you, and it made me most a lunatic. But it's all right. She had the dirk. Poor child, poor thing. If I had only been here." I just had it on my tongue's end to tell him she let Blue Fox have the dirk for a while, and I didn't know whether he give it back to her or not. But I didn't say it. Some kind of instinct told me to keep it to myself. I didn't know why, but this fellow was the quickest devil you ever see. He see me hesitate, and he darted a look at me and bored into mine like he was trying to see what it was I was keeping back in my mind. But I held my face quiet and never let on. So then he looked considerable easier, but not entirely easy, and says, "She had a dirk. Didn't you see her have a dirk?" "Yes," I says. "Well, then it's all right. She didn't lose it nor give it away nor anything, did she? She had it with her when they carried her away, didn't she?" Of course, I didn't know whether she did or not, but I said yes because it seemed the thing to say. "You are sure?" he says. "Yes, perfectly sure," I says. "I ain't guessing, I know she had it with her." He looked very grateful then and drawed a long sigh and says, "Ah, the poor child, poor friendless little thing. Thank God she's dead." I couldn't make out why he wanted her to be dead, nor how he could seem to be so thankful for it. As for me, I hoped she wasn't, and I hoped we would find her yet and get her and Flaxie away from the Injuns alive and well, too, and I weren't going to let myself be discouraged out of that thought either. We started for the Injun camp, and when Tom was on ahead a piece, I up and asked Brace if he actually hoped Peggy was dead, and if he did, why he did. He explained it to me, and then it was all clear. When we got to the camp, we looked at the bodies a minute, and then Brace said we would bury them presently, but he wanted to look around and make some inquiries first. So he turned over the ashes of the fire, examining them careful, and examining any little thing he found amongst them, and the tracks and any little rag or such like matter that was laying around, and pulled out one of the arrows and examined that, and talked to himself all the time, saying, "Sioux, yes, Sioux, that's plain," and other remarks like that. I got to wandering around, too, and once when I was a step or two away from him, lo and behold, I found Peggy's little dirk knife on the ground. It just took my breath, and I reckon I made a kind of a start, for it attracted his attention, and he asked me if I'd found something, and I said yes, and dropped on my knees so that the knife was under my leg. And when he was coming, I let some moccasin beads drop on the ground that I had found before, and pretended to be looking at them. And he come and took them up, and whilst he was turning them over in his hand, examining them, I slipped the dirk into my pocket. And presently, as soon as it was dark, I slipped out of our camp and carried it away off about a quarter of a mile and throwed it amongst the grass. But I warn't satisfied. It seemed to me that it would be just like that fellow to stumble on it and find it, he was so sharp. I didn't even dast to bury it, I was so afraid he'd find it. So at last I took and cut a little hole and shoved it in betwixt the linings of my jacket. And then I was satisfied. I was glad I thought of that, for it was like having a keepsake from Peggy and something to remember her by, always as long as I lived. Chapter 5. That night in camp, after we had buried the bodies, we sat around and talked, and me and Tom told Brace all about how we come to be there, on account of Tom wanting us to go with him and hunt up some Injuns and live with them a while. And Brace said it was just like boys the world over, and just the same way it was with him when he was a boy. And as we talked along, you could see he warmed to us because we thought so much of Peggy and told him so many things she done and said, and how she looked. And now and then, as we spoke of the Injuns, a most wicked look would settle into his face, but at these times he never said nothing. There were some things which he was a good deal puzzled about, and now and then he would bust into the middle of the talk with a remark that showed us his mind had been wandering to them things. Once he says, "I wonder what nation put 'em on the warpath. It was perfectly peaceable on the plains a little while back, or I wouldn't have had the folks start, of course. And I wonder if it's general war or only some little private thing." Of course, we couldn't tell him, so had to let him puzzle along. Another time he busted in and says, "It's the puzzlingest thing. There's features about it that I can't seem to make head nor tail of no way. I can understand why they fooled around here 3 or 4 days, because there warn't no hurry. They knowed they had from here to Oregon to do the job in. And besides, an Injun is patient. He'd rather wait a month till he can make sure of his game without any risk to his own skin than attempt it sooner where there's the least risk. I can understand why they planned a buffalo hunt that would separate all the whites from each other and make the mastering of them easy and certain. Because 5 warriors, not yet 15, won't tackle 5 men and 2 boys, even by surprise when they're asleep at dawn, when there's a safer way. Yes, I can understand all that. It's Injun and easy. But the thing that gets me is, what made them throw over the buffalo plan and act in such a hurry at last? For they did act in a hurry. You see, an Injun don't kill a whole gang that way, right out and out, unless he's mighty mad or in a desperate hurry. After they got the young men safe out of the way, they would have saved at least the old man for the torture. It clear beats me. I can't understand it. For a minute I couldn't help him out any. I couldn't think of anything to make them in a hurry. But Tom, he remembered about me telling the Injuns the Millses was expecting 7 friends, and they looked off and see Peggy and Flaxie on the watch out for them. So Brace says, "That's all right then. I understand it now. That's Injun. That would make 'em drop the buffalo business and hurry up things. I know why they didn't kill the nigger, and why they haven't killed him yet and ain't going to nor hurt him. And now if I only knowed whether this is general war or only a little private spurt, I would be satisfied and not bother any more. But, well, hang it, let it go. There ain't any way to find out." So we dropped back on the details again, and by I was telling how a man afraid of his mother-in-law streaked his face all over with blood after he killed Mr. Mills, and then, "Why, he done that for war paint," says Brace Johnson, excited. "Warn't he in war outfit before? Weren't they all painted?" "All but him," I says. "He never wore paint nor danced with the rest in the war dance." "Why didn't you tell me that before? It explains everything." "I did tell you," I says, "but you weren't listening." "It's all right now, boys," he says, "and I'm glad it's the way it is, for I wasn't feeling willing to let you go along with me, because I didn't know but all the Injuns was after the whites, and it was a general war, and so it would be bad business to let you get into it, and we couldn't dare to travel except by night anyway. But you're all right now, and can shove out with me in the morning, for this is nothing but a little private grudge, and like as not this is the end of it. You see, some white man has killed a relation of that Injun, and so he had hunted up some whites to retaliate on. It wouldn't be the proper thing for him to ever appear in war fixins again till he had killed a white man and wiped out that score. He was in disgrace till he had done that. So he didn't lose any time about piling on something that would answer for war paint. And I reckon he got off a few war whoops, too, as soon as he could to exercise his throat and get the taste of it in his mouth again. They're probably satisfied now, and there won't be any more trouble." So poor Peggy guessed right. That Injun was in mourning. He had lost a friend, but it turns out that he knowed better how to comfort himself than she could do it for him. We had breakfast just at dawn in the morning, and then rushed our arrangement through. We took provisions and such like things as we couldn't get along without, and packed them on one of the mules, and cached the rest of Brace's truck, that is, buried it, and then Brace struck the Injun trail, and we all rode away westward. Me and Tom couldn't have kept it. We would have lost it every little while, but it warn't any trouble to Brace. He dashed right along like it was painted on the ground before him or paved. He was so sure Peggy had killed herself that I reckoned he would be looking out for her body, but he never seemed to. It was so strange that by and by I got into a regular sweat to find out why, and so at last I hinted something about it. But he said no, the Injuns would travel the first 24 hours without stopping, and then they would think they was far enough ahead of the Mills's 7 friends to be safe for a while, so then they would go into camp, and that's where we'd find the body. I asked him how far they would go in that time, and he says, the whole outfit was fresh and well fed up, and they had the extra horses and mules besides. They'd go as much as 80 miles, maybe 100. He seemed to be thinking about Peggy all the time and never about anything else or anybody else. So I chanced a question and says, "What'll the Injuns do with Flaxie?" "Poor little chap, she's all right, they won't hurt her. No hurry about her. We'll get her from them by and by. They're fond of children, and so they'll keep her or sell her. But whatever band gets her, she'll be the pet of that whole band, and they'll dress her fine and take good care of her. She'll be the only white child the most of the band ever saw, and the biggest curiosity they ever struck in their lives. But they'll see 'em oftener by and by if the whites ever get started to emigrating to Oregon, and I reckon they will." It didn't ever seem to strike him that Peggy wouldn't kill herself whilst Flaxie was a prisoner, but it did me. I had my doubts. Sometimes I believed she would, sometimes I reckoned she wouldn't. We nooned an hour and then went on, and about the middle of the afternoon Brace seen some Injuns away off, but we couldn't see them. We could see some little specks, that was all, but he said he could see them well enough, and it was Injuns. But they weren't going our way and didn't make us any bother, and pretty soon they was out of sight. We made about 40 or 50 miles that day and went into camp. Well, late the next day, the trail pointed for a creek and some bushes on its bank about a quarter of a mile away or more, and Brace stopped his horse and told us to ride on and see if it was the camp, and said if it was, to look around and find the body, and told us to bury it, and be tender with it and do it as good as we could, and then come to him a mile further down the creek where he would make camp. Just come there and only tell him his order was obeyed, and stop at that, and not tell him how she looked, nor what the camp was like, nor anything. And then he rode off on a walk with his head down on his bosom, and took the pack mule with him. It was the Injun camp, and the body warn't there, nor any sign of it, just as I expected. Tom was for running and telling him and cheering him up, but I knowed better. I says, "No, the thing has turned out just right. We'll stay here about long enough to dig a grave with bowie knives, and then we'll go and tell him we buried her." Tom says, "That's mysterious and crooked and good, and I like that much about it. But hang it, there ain't any sense in it, nor any advantage to anybody in it, and I ain't willing to do it." So I looked like I'd got to tell him why I reckon it would be better all around for Brace to think we found her and buried her. And at last I come out with it, and then Tom was satisfied. And when we had stayed there 3 or 4 hours, and all through the long twilight till it was plumb dark, we rode down to Brace's camp, and he was setting by his fire with his head down again, and we only just said, "It's all over, and done right," and laid down like we wanted to rest. And he only says in that deep voice of his'n, "God be good to you boys for your kindness," and kind of stroked us on the head with his hand, and that was all that anybody said. Chapter 6. After about 4 days, we begun to catch up on the Injuns. The trail got fresher and fresher. They warn't afraid now and warn't traveling fast, but we had kept up a pretty good lick all the time. At last one day we struck a camp of theirs where they had been only a few hours before, for the embers was still hot. Brace said we would go very careful now, and not get in sight of them, but keep them just a safe distance ahead. Tom said we might slip up on them in the night now and steal Jim and Flaxie away, but he said no, he had other fish to fry first, and besides it wouldn't win anyway. Me and Tom wondered what his other fish was, and pretty soon we dropped behind and got to talking about it. We couldn't make nothing out of it for certain, but we reckoned he was meaning to get even with the Injuns and kill some of them before he took any risks about other things. I remembered he said we would get Flaxie by and by, and said there warn't no hurry about it. But then for all he talked so bitter about Injuns, it didn't look as if he could actually kill one, for he was the gentlest, kindest-hearted grown person I ever see. We killed considerable game these days, and about this time here comes an antelope scampering towards us. He was a real pretty little creature. He stops about 30 yards off and sets up his head and arches up his neck and goes to gazing at us out of his bright eyes as innocent as a baby. Brace fetches his gun up to his shoulder, but waited, and so the antelope capered off, zigzagging first to one side and then t'other, awful graceful, and then stretches straight away across the prairie, swift as the wind, and Brace took his gun down. In a little while here comes the antelope back again and stopped 100 yards off and stood still, gazing at us same as before, and wondering who we was and if we was friendly, I reckon. Brace fetches up his gun twice and then the third time, and this time he fired and the little fellow tumbled. Me and Tom was starting for him, seeing Brace didn't, but Brace says, "Better wait a minute, boys, you don't know the antelope. Let him die first. Because if that little trustin' harmless thing looks up in your face with its grieved eyes when it's dying, you'll never forget it. When I'm out of meat I kill them, but I don't go around them till they're dead, since the first one." Tom give me a look, and I give Tom a look, as much as to say, his fish ain't revenge, that's certain, and so what the mischief is it? According to my notions, Brace Johnson was a beautiful man. He was more than 6 foot tall, I reckon, and had broad shoulders, and he was as straight as a jackstaff and built as trim as a racehorse. He had the steadiest eye you ever see and a handsome face, and his hair hung all down his back, and how he ever could keep his outfit so clean and nice I never could tell, but he did. His buckskin suit looked always like it was new, and it was all hung with fringes, and had a star as big as a plate between the shoulders of his coat, made of beads of all kinds of colors, and had beads on his moccasins, and a hat as broad as a barrel-head, and he never looked so fine and grand as he did a horseback. And a horse couldn't any more throw him than he could throw the saddle, for when it come to riding, he could lay over anything outside the circus. And as for strength, I never see a man that was any more than half as strong as what he was, and a most lightning marksman with a gun or a bow or a pistol. He had 2 long-barreled ones in his holsters and could shoot a pipe out of your mouth most any distance, every time, if you wanted him to. It didn't seem as if he ever got tired, though he stood most of the watch every night himself, and let me and Tom sleep. We was always glad, for his sake, when a very dark night come, because then we all slept all night and didn't stand any watch. For Brace said Injuns ain't likely to try to steal your horses on such nights, because if you woke up and managed to kill them and they died in the dark, it was their notion and belief that it would always be dark to them in the happy hunting grounds all through eternity. And so you don't often hear of Indians attacking in the night. They do it just at dawn, And when they do ever chance it in the night, it's only moonlight ones, not dark ones. He didn't talk very much, and when he talked about Injuns, he talked the same as if he was talking about animals. He didn't seem to have much idea that they was men. But he had some of their ways himself on account of being so long amongst them, and moreover he had their religion. And one of the things that puzzled him was how such animals ever struck such a sensible religion. He said the Injuns hadn't only but two gods, a good one and a bad one, and they never paid no attention to the good one, nor ever prayed to him or worried about him at all, but only tried their level best to flatter up the bad god and keep on the good side of him, because the good one loved them and would never think of doing them any harm, and so there warn't any occasion to be bothering him with prayers and things, because he was always doing the very best he could for them anyway, and prayers couldn't better it. But all the trouble come from the bad god, who was sitting up nights to think up ways to bring them bad luck and bust up all their plans, and never fooled away a chance to do them all the harm he could. And so the sensible thing was to keep praying and fussing around him all the time and get him to let up. Brace thought more of the Great Spirit than he did of his own mother, but he never fretted about him. He said his mother wouldn't hurt him, would she? Well, then the Great Spirit wouldn't, that was sure. Now, as to that antelope, it brought us some pretty bad luck. When we was done supper that day and was setting round talking and smoking, Brace begun to make some calculations about where we might be by next Saturday, as if he thought this day was a Saturday too, while it wasn't. So Tom, he interrupted him and told him it was Friday. They argued over it, but Tom turned out to be right. Brace sat there a while thinking and looking kind of troubled. Then he says, "It's my mistake, boys, and all my fault for my carelessness. We're in for some bad luck, and we can't get around it. So the best way is to keep a sharp lookout for it and beat it if we can. I mean, make it come as light as we can, for of course we can't beat it altogether." Tom asked him why he reckoned we would have bad luck, and it come out that the bad god was going to fix it for us. He didn't say bad god out and out, didn't mention his name, seemed to be afraid to, said he and him, but we understood. He said a body had got to perpetuate him in all kinds of ways. Tom allowed he said propitiate, but I heard him as well as Tom, and he said perpetuate. He said the commonest way and the best way to perpetuate him was to deny yourself something and make yourself uncomfortable, same as you do in any religion. So one of his plans was to try to perpetuate him by vowing to never allow himself to eat meat on Fridays and Sundays, even if he was starving. And now he had gone and ate it on a Friday, and he'd druther have cut his hand off than done it if he had knowed. He said he has got the advantage of us now, and you could bet he would make the most of it. We would have a run of bad luck now, and no knowing when it would begin or when it would stop. We had been pretty cheerful before that, galloping over them beautiful plains and popping at jackrabbits and prairie dogs and all sorts of things, and snuffing the fresh air of the early mornings and all that, and having a general good time. But it was all busted up now, and we quit talking and got terrible blue and uneasy and scared. And Brace, he was bluest of all and kept getting up all night and looking around when it wasn't his watch. And he put out the campfire, too, and several times he went out and took a wide turn around the camp to see if everything was right. And every now and then he would say, "Well, it hain't come yet, but it's comin'." It come the next morning. We started out from camp just at early dawn in a light mist, Brace and the pack mule ahead, I next, and Tom last. Pretty soon the mist begun to thicken, and Brace told us to keep the procession closed well up. In about a half an hour it was a regular fog. After a while Brace sings out, "Are you all right?" "All right," I says. By and by he sings out again, "All right, boys?" "All right," I says, and looked over my shoulder and see Tom's mule's ears through the fog. By and by Brace sings out again, and I sings out, and he says, "Answer up, Tom." But Tom didn't answer up. So he said it again, and Tom didn't answer up again. And come to look, there warn't anything there but the mule. Tom was gone. "It's come," says Brace. "I knowed it would." And we faced around and started back, shouting for Tom, but he didn't answer. Chapter 7. When we had got back a little ways, we struck wood and water, and Brace got down and begun to unsaddle. Says I, "What you going to do?" "Going to camp." "Camp?" says I. "Why, what a notion. I ain't going to camp. I'm going for Tom." "Going for Tom? Why, you fool, Tom's lost," he says, lifting off his saddle. "Of course he is," I says, "and you may camp as much as you want to, but I ain't going to desert him. I'm going for him." "Huck, you don't know what you're talking about. Get off of that mule." But I didn't. I fetched the mule a whack and started. But he grabbed him and snaked me off like I was a doll and set me on the ground. Then he says, "Keep your shirt on and maybe we'll find him, but not in the fog. Don't you reckon I know what's best to do?" He fetched a yell and listened, but didn't get any answer. We couldn't find him in the fog. We'd get lost ourselves. The thing for us to do is to stick right here till the fog blows off. Then we'll begin the hunt with some chance. I reckoned he was right, but I most wanted to kill him for eating that antelope meat and never stopping to think up what day it was, and he knowing so perfectly well what confounded luck it would fetch us. A body can't be too careful about such things. We unpacked and picketed the mules and then sat down and begun to talk, and every now and then fetched a yell but never got any answer. I says, "When the fog blows off, how long will it take us to find him, Brace?" If he was an old hand on the plains, we'd find him pretty easy, because as soon as he found he was lost, he would set down and not budge till we come. But he's green, and he won't do that. The minute a greenie finds he's lost, he can't keep still to save his life. Tries to find himself, and gets lost worse than ever. Loses his head, wears himself out, fretting and worrying and tramping in all kinds of directions. And what with starving and going without water and being so scared and getting to mooning and imagining more and more, it don't take him but 2 or 3 days to go crazy. And then, "My land, is Tom going to be lost as long as that?" I says. "It makes the cold shudders run over me to think of it." "Keep up your pluck," he says. "It ain't going to do any good to lose that." I judge Tom ain't hurt. I reckon he got down to cinch up or something, and his mule got away from him, and he trotted after it, thinking he could keep the direction where the fog swallowed it up easy enough. And in about a half a minute he was turned around and trotting the other way and didn't doubt he was right, and so didn't holler till it was too late. It's the way they always do, confound it. And so, if he ain't hurt— He stopped, and as he didn't go on, I says, "Well, if he ain't hurt, what then?" He didn't say anything right away, but at last he says, "No, I reckon he ain't hurt, and that's just the worst of it, because there ain't no power on earth can keep him still now. If he'd have broken his leg, but of course he couldn't with this kind of luck against him." We whooped now and then, but I couldn't whoop much. My heart was most broke. The fog hung on and on and on till it seemed a year, and there we sat and waited. But it was only a few hours, though it seemed so everlasting. But the sun busted through it at last, and it begun to swing off in big patches, and then Brace saddled up and took a lot of provisions with him and told me to stick close to camp and not budge. And then he cleared out and begun to ride around camp in a circle, and then in bigger circles, watching the ground for signs all the time. And so he circled wider and wider till he was far away, and then I couldn't see him any more. Then I freshened up the fire, which he told me to do, and throwed armfuls of green grass on it to make a big smoke. It went up tall and straight to the sky, and if Tom was 10 mile off, he would see it and come. I sat down blue enough to wait. The time dragged heavy. In about an hour, I see a speck away off across country and begun to watch it, and when it got bigger, it was a horseman. And pretty soon I see it was Brace, and he had something across the horse, and I reckoned it was Tom, and he was hurt. But it wasn't. It was a man. Brace laid him down and says, "Found him out yonder. He's been lost. Nobody knows how long. 2 or 3 weeks, I judge. He's pretty far gone. Give him a spoonful of soup every little while, but not much, or it will kill him. He's as crazy as a loon and tried to get away from me, but he's all used up, and he couldn't. I found Tom's trail in a sandy place, but I lost it again in the grass." So away he started again across country and left me and this fella there, and I went to making soup. He laid there with his eyes shut, breathing kind of heavy and muttering and mumbling. He was just skin and bones and rags, that's all he was. His hands was all scratched up and bloody, and his feet the same and all swelled up and wore out and a sight to look at. His face, well, I never see anything so horrible. It was baked with the sun and curled like old wallpaper that's rotted on a damp wall. His lips was cracked and dry and didn't cover his teeth, so he grinned very disagreeable like a steel trap. I judged he had walked till his feet gave out on him and then crawled around them deserts on his hands and knees, for his knees hadn't any flesh or skin on them. When I got the soup done, I touched him, and he started up scared and stared at me a second, and then tried to scramble away. But I catched him and held him pretty easy, and he's struggling and begging very pitiful for me to let him go and not kill him. I told him I warn't going to hurt him, and had made some nice soup for him, but he wouldn't touch it at first, and shoved the spoon away and said it made him sick to see it. But I persuaded him and told him I would let him go if he would eat a little first. So then he made me promise 3 or 4 times, and then he took a couple of spoonfuls. And straight off he got just wild and ravenous, and wanted it all. I fed him a cupful and then carried the rest off and hid it. And so there I had to sit by the hour, and him begging for more. And about every half hour I'd give him a little, and his eyes would blaze at the sight of it, and he would grab the cup out of my hands and take it all down at a gulp, and then try to crowd his mouth into it to lick the bottom and get just raging and frantic because he couldn't. Between times he would quiet down and doze, and then start up wild and say, "Lost! My God, lost!" and then see me and recollect and go to begging for something to eat again. I tried to get something out of him about himself, but his head was all wrong, and you couldn't make head nor tail of what he said. Sometimes he seemed to say he had been lost 10 years, and sometimes it was 10 weeks. And once I judged he said a year, and that is all I could get out of him, and no particulars. He had a little gold locket on a gold chain around his neck, and he would take that out and open it and gaze at it and forget what he was doing and doze off again. It had a most starchy young woman in it, dressed up regardless, and 2 little children in her arms, painted on ivory, like some the widow Douglas had on her old ancestors in Scotland. This kind of worry and sweat went on the whole day long, and was the longest day I ever see. And then the sun was going down, and no Tom and no Brace. This fellow was sound asleep for about the first time. I took a look at him and judged it would last, so I thought I would run out and water the mules and put on their sidelines and get right back again before he stirred. But the pack mule had pulled his lariat loose and was a little ways off dragging it after him and grazing, and I walked along after him, but every time I got pretty close he throwed up his head and trotted a few steps. And first I knowed he had told me a long ways, and I wished I had the other mule to catch him with, but I dasn't go back after him because the dark would catch me and I would lose this one, sure. So I had to keep tagging along after him afoot, coming as near to cussing the antelope meat as I dast, and getting powerful nervous all the time and wondering if some more of us was going to get lost. And I would have got lost if I hadn't had a pretty big fire, for you could just barely see it away back yonder like a red spark when I catched the mule at last, and it was plumb dark too, and getting black before I got home. It was that black when I got to camp that you couldn't see at all, and I judged the mules would get water enough pretty soon without any of my help. So I picketed them closer than there was before, and put on their sidelines and groped into the tent, and bent over this fellow to hear if he was there yet, and all of a sudden it busted on me that I'd been gone 2 or 3 hours. I didn't know how long. And of course he was out and gone long ago. And how in the nation would I ever find him in the dark? And this awful storm coming up. And just at that minute I hear the wind begin to shiver along amongst the leaves, and the thunder to mumble and grumble away off. And the cold chills went through me to think of him again in the dark and the rain. Dad fetch him for making all this trouble. Poor pitiful rat, so far from home and lost. And I so sorry for him, too. So I held my breath and listened over him, and by Jackson he was there yet, and I hear him breathe about once a minute. Once a week would have done me, though. It sounded so good to hear him, and I was so thankful he hadn't sloped. I fastened the flap of the tent and then stretched out snug on my blankets, wishing Tom and Brace was there. And thinks I'll let myself enjoy this about 5 minutes before I sail out and freshen up the campfire. The next thing that I knowed anything about was no telling how many hours afterwards. I sort of worked along up out of a solid sleep then, and when I come to myself the whole earth was rocking with the smashingest blast of thunder I ever heard in my life, and the rain was pouring down like the bottom had fell out of the sky. Says I, now I've done it. The campfire's out and no way for Tom or Brace to find the camp. I let out and it was so. Everything drenched, not a sign of an ember left. Of course, nobody could ever start a new fire out there in the rain and wind. But I could build one inside and fetch it out after it got to going good. So I rushed in and went to bulging around in the dark and lost myself and fell over this fellow and scrambled up off of him and begged his pardon and asked if I heard him, but he never said a word and didn't make a sound. And just then comes one of them blind white glares of lightning that turns midnight to daytime, and there he laid, grinning up at me, stone dead. And he had hunks of bread and meat around, and I see in a second how it all was. He had got at our grub whilst I was after the mule, and overed himself and died. And I'd been sleeping along perfectly comfortable with his relics I don't know how long, and him the gashliest sight I ever struck. But I never waited there to think all that. I was out in the public wilderness before the flash got done quivering, and I never went back no more. I let him have it all to his own self. I didn't want no company. I went off a good ways and stayed the rest of the night out and got most drownded. And about an hour or more after sunup, Tom and Brace come, and I was glad. I told them how things had went, and we took the gold locket and buried the man and had breakfast. And Brace didn't scold me once. Tom was about used up, and we had to stay there a day or two for him to get straightened up again. I asked him all about it, and he says, "I got down to cinch up, and I nearly trod on a rattlesnake, which I didn't see, but heard him go bzzz right at my heel. I jumped most a rod, I was so scared and taken so sudden, and I run about 3 steps, and then looked back over my shoulder, and my mule was gone. Nothing but just white fog there. I forgot the snake in a second and went for the mule. For 10 steps I didn't hurry, expecting to see him all the time. But I picked up my heels then and run. When I'd run a piece, I got a little nervous and was just going to yell, though I was ashamed to, when I thought I heard voices ahead of me bearing to the right, and that give me confidence, knowing it must be you boys. So I went heeling it after you on a shortcut. But if I did hear voices, I misjudged the direction and went the other way because, you can't really tell where a sound comes from in a fog. I reckon you was trotting in one direction and me in the other because it warn't long before I got uneasy and begun to holler, and you didn't hear me nor answer. Well, that scared me so that I begun to tremble all over, and I did wish the fog would lift, but it didn't. It shut me in all around like a thick white smoke. I wanted to wait and let you miss me and come back, but I couldn't stay still a second. It would have killed me. I had to run, and I did. And so I kept on running by the hour and listening and shouting, but never a sound did ever I hear. And whenever I stopped just a moment and held my breath to listen, it was the awfulest stillness that ever was, and I couldn't stand it and had to run on again. This story is continued on Disc 2. Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer Among the Indians by Mark Twain and Lee Nelson. Continued. Disc 2. When I got so beat out and tired I couldn't run any more, I walked. And when the fog went off at last and I looked over my shoulder and there was a tall smoke going up in the sky miles across the plain behind me, I says to myself if that was ahead of me it might be Huck and Brace camping and waiting for me, but it's in the wrong direction. And maybe it's Injuns and not whites. So I wouldn't take any chances on it but kept right on, and by I thought I could see something away off on the prairie, but it was Brace, but I didn't know it, and so I hid. I saw him or something twice more before night, and I hid both times. And I walked between times further and further away from that smoke and stuck to ground that wouldn't leave much of a track. And in the night I walked and crawled together because I couldn't bear to keep still and was so hungry and so scratched up with cactuses and getting kind of out of my head besides. But the storm drove me up onto a swell to get out of the water, and there I stayed and took it. Brace, he searched for me till dark and then struck for home, calculating to strike for the campfire and lead his horse and pick his way. But the storm was too heavy for that, and he had to stop and give up that notion. And besides, you let the fire go out anyway. I went crawling off as soon as dawn came and making a good trail, the ground was so wet. And Brace found it, and then he found me. And the next time I get down to cinch up a mule in the fog, I'll notify the rest of you. And the next time I'm lost and see a smoke, I'll go for it. I don't care if it comes out of the pit. Chapter 8. We was away along up the North Fork of the Platte now. When we started again, the Injuns was 2 or 3 days ahead of us, and their trail was pretty much washed out. But Brace didn't mind it. He judged he knowed where they was striking for. He had been reading the signs in their old camps all these days, and he said these Sioux was Ogalallas. We struck a hilly country now and traveled the day through and camped a few miles up a nice valley late in the afternoon on top of a low, flattish hill in a grove of small trees. It was an uncommon pretty place, and we picked it out on account of Tom because he hadn't stood the trip well, and we calculated to rest him there another day or two. The valley was a nearly level swale, a mile or a mile and a half wide, and had a little riverbed in it with steep banks and trees along it. Not much of a river because you could throw a brick across it, but very deep when it was full of water, which it wasn't now. But Brace said we would find puddles along in its bed, so him and me took the animals and a bucket, and left Tom in camp and struck down our hill and rode across the valley to water them. When we got to the river, we found new-made tracks along the bank, and Brace said there was about 20 horses in that party. And there was white men in it because some of the horses had shoes on, and likely they was from out Fort Laramie way. There was a puddle or two, but Brace couldn't get down the banks easy, so he told me to wait with the mules, and if he didn't find a better place, he would come back and rig some way to get up and down the bank here. Then he rode off downstream, and pretty soon the trees hit him. By and by an antelope darts by me, and I look up the river, and around a corner of the timber comes two men riding fast. When they got to me, they reined up and begun to ask me questions. They was half drunk and a mighty rough-looking couple, and their clothes didn't help them much, being old greasy buckskin, just about all black with dirt. I was afraid of them. They asked me who I was and where I come from and how many was with me and where we was camped. And I told them my name was Archibald Thompson, and says, "Our camp's down at the foot of the valley, and we're traveling for Pap's health. He's very sick. We can't travel no more till he gets better, and there ain't nobody to take care of him but me and Aunt Mary and Sis. And so we're in a heap of trouble." "It's all a lie," one of them breaks in. "You've stole them animals." "You bet he has," says the other. "Why, I know this one myself. He belongs to old Vasquez the trader up at the fort, and I'm dead certain I seen one of the others somewheres." "Seen him? I reckon you have. Belongs to Rubadoo the blacksmith, and he'll be powerful glad we found him again. I knowed him in a minute. Come, boy, I'm right down sorry for your sick pap and poor Aunt Mary and Sis, but all the same you'll go along back to our camp. And you want to be mighty civil and go mighty careful, or first you know you'll get hung." First I didn't know what to do, but I had to work my mind quick. And I struck a sort of an idea, the best I could think of right off that way. I says to myself, it's 2-to-1 these is horse thieves, because Brace says there's a plenty of them in these regions. And so I reckon they'd like to get 1 or 2 more while they're at it. Then I up and says, "Gents, as sure as I'm here, I never stole the animals. And if I'll prove it to you, you'll let me go, won't you?" "How are you going to prove it?" "I'll do it easy if you'll come along with me, for we bought 2 mules that's almost just like these from the Injuns day before yesterday. And maybe they stole them, I don't know, but we didn't, that's sure." They looked at each other and says, "Where are they, down at your camp?" "No, they're only down here 300 or 400 yards. Sister Mary, she—" "Has she got them?" "Yes." "Anybody with her?" "No." "Trot along, then, and don't you try to come any tricks, boy, or you'll get hurt." I didn't wait for a second invite, but started right along, keeping a sharp lookout for Brace and getting my yell ready as soon as I should see him. I edged ahead all I could, and they notified me a couple of times not to shove along so fast because there weren't no hurry. And pretty soon they noticed Brace's trail and sung out to me to halt a minute and bent down over their saddles and checked up their speed and was mightily interested, as I could see when I looked back. I didn't halt, but jogged ahead and kept widening the distance. They sung out again and threatened me, and then I brushed by Brace's horse in the trees and knowed Brace was down the bank or close by. So I raised a yell and put up my speed to just the highest notch the mules could reach. I looked back, and here they come. The next comes a bullet whizzing by. I whacked away for life and death and looked back, and they was gaining. Looked back again and see Brace booming after the hind one like a house afire and swinging long coils of his lariat over his head. Then he sent it sailing through the air, and as it scooped that fella in, Brace reined back his horse and yanked him out of his saddle, and then come tearing ahead again, dragging him. He yelled to me to get out of range, and so I turned out sudden and looked back, and my man had wheeled and was raising his gun on Brace, but Brace's pistol was too quick for him, and down he went out of his saddle. Well, we had 2 dead men on our hands, and I felt pretty crawly, and didn't like to look at them, but Brace allowed it warn't a very unpleasant sight, considering they tried to kill me. He said we must hurry into camp now and get ready for trouble. So we shoved for camp and took the 2 new horses and the men's guns and things with us, not waiting to water our animals. It was nearly dark. We kept a watch out towards up the river, but didn't see anything stirring. When we got home, we still watched from the edge of the grove, but didn't see anything, and no sign of that gang's campfire. Then Brace said we was probably safe from them for the rest of the night, so we would rest the animals 3 or 4 hours and then start out and get as well ahead as we could, and keep ahead as long as this blamed Friday antelope luck would let us, if Tom could stand the travel. It come on starlight, a real beautiful starlight, and all the world as still and lovely as Sunday. By and by, Brace said it would be a good idea to find out where the thieves was camped, so we could give it a wide berth when we started. And he said I could come along if I wanted to, and he took his gun along this time, and I took one of the thieves' guns. We took the 2 fresh horses and rode down across the valley and struck the river, and then went pretty cautious up it. We went as much as 2 mile, and not a sign of a campfire anywheres, so we kept on, wondering where it could be, because we could see a long ways up the valley. And then all of a sudden we heard people laugh, and not very far off, maybe 40 or 50 yards. It come from the river. We went back 100 yards and tied the horses amongst the trees, and then back again afoot till we was close to the place where we heard it before, and slipped in amongst the trees and listened, and heard the voices again pretty close by. Then we crept along on our knees, slow and careful, to the edge of the bank, through the brush, and there was the camp, a little ways up, and right in the dry bed of the river. 2 big buffalo skin lodges, a band of horses tied, and 8 men carousing and gambling around a fire. All white men, and the roughest kind, and prime drunk. Brace said they had camped there so their camp couldn't be seen easy, but they might as well camped in the open as go and get drunk and make such a noise. He said they was horse thieves, certain. We was interested and stayed looking a considerable time. But the liquor begun to beat them, and first one and then another went gaping and stretching to the tents and turned in. And then another one started, and the others tried to make him stay up because it was his watch, but he said he was drunk and sleepy and didn't want to watch, and said, "Let Jack and Bill stand my watch as long as they like to be up late. They'll be in directly, like as not." But the others threatened to lick him if he didn't stand his watch, so he grumbled but give in, and got his gun and set down. And when the others was all gone to roost, he just stretched himself out and went to snoring as comfortable as anybody. We left then and sneaked down to where our horses was and rode away, leaving the rapscallions to sleep it out and wait for Jack and Bill to come, but we reckoned they'd have to wait a most notorious long time first. We rode down the river to where Brace was when I yelled to him when the thieves was after me, and he said he had dug some steps in the bank there with his buoy, and we could finish the job in a little while. And when we broke camp and started, we would bring our mules there and water them. So we tied our horses and went down into the riverbed to the puddle that was there and laid down on our breasts to take a drink. But Brace says, "Hello, what's that?" It was as still as death before, but you could hear a faint, steady rising sound now up the river. We held our breath and listened. You could see a good stretch up it, and tolerable clear, too, the starlight was so strong. The sound kept growing and growing very fast. Then all of a sudden Brace says, "Jump for the bank, I know what that is." It's always my plan to jump first and ask afterwards, so I done it. Brace says, "There's a water spout broke loose up country somewheres, and you'll see sights mighty soon now." "Do they break when there ain't no clouds in the sky?" I says, judging I had him. "Ne'er you mind," he says, "there was clouds where this one broke. I've seen this kind of thing before, and I know that sound. Fasten your horse just as tight as you can, or he'll break loose presently." The sound got bigger and bigger, and away up yonder it was just one big, dull, thundering roar. We looked up the river a piece and see something coming down its bed like dim white snakes writhing along. When it went hissing and sizzling by us, it was shallow, foamy water. About 20 yards behind it comes a solid wall of water 4 foot high, and nearly straight up and down. And before you could wink, it went rumbling and howling by like a whirlwind, and carrying logs along, and them thieves, too, and their horses and tents, and tossing them up in sight, and then under a gun, and grinding them to hash, and the noise was just awful. You couldn't have heard it thunder, and our horses was plunging and pitching and trying their best to break loose. Well, before we could turn around, the water was over the banks and ankle deep. Out of this, Huck, and shin for camp, or we're goners." We was mounted and off in a second, with the water chasing after us. We rode for life, we went like the wind, but we didn't have to use whip or spur. The horses didn't need no encouragement. Halfway across the valley, we met the water flooding down from above. And from there on, the horses was up to their knees sometimes, yes, and even up to their bellies towards the last. All hands was glad when we struck our hill and sailed up it out of danger. Chapter 9. Our little low hill was an island now, and we couldn't have got away from it if we had wanted to. We all three sat around and watched the water rise. It rose wonderful fast, just walked up the long gradual slope, as you may say, it come up so fast. It didn't stop rising for 2 or 3 hours, and then that whole valley was just a big level river 1 mile to 1.5 miles wide, and deep enough to swim the biggest ship that was ever built, and no end of dim black drift logs spinning around and sailing by in the currents on its surface. Bray said it hadn't took the waterspout an hour to dump all that ocean of water and finish up its job, but like enough it'd be a week before the valley was free of it again. So Tom would have considerable more time than we bargained to give him to get well in. Me and Tom was downhearted and miserable on account of Jim and Peggy and Flaxie, because we reckoned it was all up with them and the Injuns now. And so at last Tom throwed out a feeler to see what Brace thought. Tom never said anything about the others, but only about the Injuns. Said the waterspout must have got the Injuns, hadn't it? But Brace says, "No, nary an Injun. Waterspouts don't catch any but white folks. There warn't ever a white man that could tell when a waterspout's comin'. And how the nation an Injun can tell is something I never could make out, but they can. When it's perfectly clear weather and other people ain't expectin' anything, they'll say all of a sudden, 'Heap water comin', and pack up in a hurry and shove for high ground. They say they smell it. I don't know whether that's so or not. But one thing I do know, a waterspout often catches a white man, but it don't ever catch an Injun." Next morning there we was on an island, same as before. Just a level, shinin' ocean everywheres, and perfectly still and quiet, like it was asleep. And awful lonesome. Next day the same, only lonesomer than ever. And next day just the same, and mighty hard work to put in the time. Mostly we slept. And after a long sleep, wake up and eat dinner and look out over the tiresome water and go to sleep again. And wake up again by and by and see the sun go down and turn it into blood and fire and melted butter and one thing or another, awful beautiful and soft and lovely, but solemn and lonesome till you couldn't rest. We had 8 days of that, and the longer we waited for that ocean to play out and run off, the bigger the notion I got of a waterspout that could puke out such a mortal lot of water as that in an hour. We left then and made a good day's travel, and by sundown begun to come on to fresh buffalo carcasses. There were so many of them that Brace reckoned there was a big party of Injuns near, or else white from the fort. In the morning we hadn't gone 5 miles till we struck a big camp where Injuns had been, and hadn't gone more than a day or 2. Brace said there was as many as 100 of them altogether, men, women, and children, and made up from more than one band of Sioux, but brûlés mostly, as he judged by the signs. Brace said things looked like these Injuns was camped here a considerable time. Of course, we weren't thinking about our Injuns or expecting to run across any signs of them or the prisoners. But Tom, he found an arrow broke in 2, which was wound with blue silk thread down by the feather. And he said he knowed it was hog faces because he got the silk for him from Peggy and watched him wind it. So Brace begun to look around for other signs, and he believed he found some. Well, I was ciphering around in a general way myself, and outside of the camp I run across a ragged piece of Peggy's dress as big as a big handkerchief, and it had blood on it. It most froze me to see that, because I judged she was killed, and if she warn't, it stood to reason she was hurt. I hid the rag under a buffalo chip, because if Brace was to see it, he might suspicion she wasn't dead after all the pains we had took to make him believe she was. And just then he sings out, "Run here, boys!" And Tom, he come running from one way and I the other. And when we got to him, there in the middle of the camp, he points down and says, "There, that's the shoe print of a white woman. See, you can see where she turned it down to one side, how thin the sole is. She's white, and she's a prisoner with this gang of Injuns. I don't understand it. I'm afraid there's general trouble broke out between the whites and Injuns, and if that's so, I've got to go mighty cautious from this out." He looks at the track again and says, Poor thing, it's hard luck for her, and went mumbling off, and never noticed that me and Tom was most dead with uneasiness, for we could see plain enough it was Peggy's print, and was afraid he would see it himself, or think he did, any minute. His back wasn't more than turned before me and Tom had tramped on the print once or twice, just enough to take the clearness out of it, because we didn't know but he might come back for another look. Pretty soon we see him over yonder looking at something, and we went there, and it was 4 stakes drove in the ground. And he looks us very straight and steady in the eyes, first me and then Tom, and then me again, till it got pretty sultry. Then he says cold and level, but just as if he'd been asking us a question, "Well, I believe you. Come along." Me and Tom followed along a piece behind, and Tom says, "Huck, he's so afraid she's alive that it's just all he can do to believe that yarn of ours about burying her, and pretty soon now like enough he'll find out she ain't dead after all." "That's just what's worrying me, Tom. It puts us in a scrape, and I don't see no way out of it, because what can we say when he tackles us about lying to him?" "I know what to say well enough." "You do? Well, I wish you'd tell me, for I'm blamed if I see any way out. I wouldn't know a single word to say." "I'll say this to him. I'll say, suppose it was likely you was going to get knocked in the head with a club some time or other, but it warn't quite certain. Would you want to be knocked in the head straight off so as to make it certain, or wouldn't you rather wait and see if you mightn't live your life out and not happen to get clubbed at all?" "Of course," he would say. Then I would put it at him straight and say, "Wasn't you happier when we made you think she was dead than you was before? Didn't it keep you happy all this time? Of course. Well, wasn't it worth a little small lie like that to keep you happy instead of awfully miserable many days and nights? Of course. And wasn't it like she would be dead before you ever run across her again, which would make our lie plenty good enough? True again. And at least I would up and say, just you put yourself in our place, Brace Johnson. Now, honor bright, would you have told the truth that time and broke the heart of the man that was Peggy Mills's idol? If you could, you are not a man, you are a devil. If you could and did, you'd be lower and hard-hearteder than the devils. You'd be an Injun. That's what I'll say to him, Huck, if the time ever comes." Now that was the cleanest and slickest way out that ever was, and who would ever have thought of it but Tom Sawyer? I never seen the likes of that boy for just solid gobs of brains and level-headedness. It made me comfortable right away, because I knowed very well Brace Johnson could never get around that, nor under it, nor over it, nor through it. He would have to answer up and confess he would have told that lie his own self, and would have went on backing it up and standing by it too, as long as he had a rag of a lie left in him to do it with. I noticed, but I never said anything, that Tom was putting the Injuns below the devils now. You see, he had about got it through his noodle by this time that book Injuns and real Injuns is different. Brace was unslinging the pack, so we went to him to see what he was doing it for, and he says, "Well, I don't understand that white woman's being with this band of Injuns. Of course, maybe she was took prisoner years ago away yonder on the edge of the States, and has been sold from band to band ever since all the way across the plains. I say, of course, that may be the explanation of it, but as long as I don't know that that's the way of it, I ain't going to take any chances. I'll just do the other thing. I'll consider that this woman is a new prisoner, and that her being here means that there's trouble broked out betwixt the Injuns and the whites, and so I'll act accordin'. That is, I'll keep shy of Injuns till I've fixed myself up a little, so's to fit the new circumstances." He had got a needle and some thread out of the pack, and a little paper bag full of dried bugs and butterflies and lizards and frogs and such like creatures, and he sat down and went to sewing them fast to the lapels of his buckskin coat and all over his slouch hat, till he was that fantastic he looked like he had just broke out of a museum when he got it all done. Then he says, "Now, if I act strange and foolish, the Injuns will think I'm crazy, so I'll be safe and all right. They are afraid to hurt a crazy man because they think he's under his special persecution." He meant the bad God, you know, for his sins, and they kind of avoid him and don't much like to be around him because they think he's bad medicine, as they call it. Medicine meaning luck, about as near as you can put it into English. I got this idea from a chap they called a naturalist. A war party of Injuns dropped onto him, and if he'd 'a' knowed his danger, he'd 'a' been scared to death. But he didn't know a war party from a peace party, and so he didn't act afraid. And that bothered the Injuns. They didn't know what to make of it. And when they see how anxious and particular he was about his bugs, and how fond of them and stuck after them he seemed to be, They judged he was out of his mind, and so they let him go his own gait and never touched him. I've gone fixed for the crazy line ever since. Then he packed the mule again and says, "Now we'll get along again and follow the trail of the Injuns." But it bore nearly straight north, and that warn't what he was expecting. So he rode off on the desert and struck another trail which bore more to the west. And this one he examined very careful and mumbled a good deal to himself, but said at last that this was our Injuns, though there was more horses in the party than there was before. He knowed it by signs, he said, but he didn't say what the signs was. We struck out on this trail and followed it a couple of days. Each day we went a little slower. We weren't among the grass waves no more, but in hilly country with rocky ledges along the tops of some of the ridges. It warn't the hills that made us go slow, but the constant stoppin', with me and Tom holding the horses and mules while Brace clumb the nearest rise to look up ahead for signs of the Injun camp. One time he comes scrambling down to tell us he's seen smoke. He say the Injun camp is just ahead. It'd be time to save Flaxie and Jim and that other white woman. When we find some trees around a nice little spring of clear water, Brace says we got to hide our outfit and the horses and mules. After taking off the saddles and packs, we picket the animals amongst the trees with ropes tied to their front feet instead of their necks so they won't get tangled up. Brace figured the trees would make it hard for an Injun from the camp to see our outfit and stock, even if he clumb the highest hill. Then we stuff our coat pockets with biscuits and dried meat because Brace don't know how long it will take to do the rescuing, and we might get hungry. Tom and me carries the 2 rifles we took from the horse thieves. Brace has his own rifle and the 2 pistols in his belt. We each have a bowie, too. Seeing the serious look on Brace's face as he checks his powder, I know he means business. "How's one man and 2 boys going to lick a whole band of Injuns?" I asks. "And there might be more than the 5 who killed Peggy's family, there being more horse tracks than before." "Don't know," Brace says simply. "Need to find them first, count them, count their animals, look at the layout, consider possibilities. Then we figure a way to do it." And off we went. It warn't much of a plan, it seemed to me, for marching into the camp of a bunch of murderin' Injuns, but what did I know? Just a boy who grew up on the river and never knowed nothin' about Injuns nohow. So I said nothin', and neither did Tom, which surprised me a lot. Tom always had a lot to say about everything, even when he didn't know nothin' about it. As I was wondering why he didn't want to talk now, it occurred to me that maybe he was scared. That's it. I'll bet Tom was so scared he lost his pluck. He had never admitted, at least not to Brace. So on we marched, up a little valley and to the top of a hill covered with brush and stone ledges. Brace, without saying a word, points his arm at us, palm open, a signal for us to lay low and not say nothin'. He stands that way for a long time, like a dog pointing at a wild chicken in a bush, not moving, looking real careful up ahead. We daren't move. Finally, Brace motions for us to come up and follow him to a clump of thick bushes. When we gets there, he says, "They've been hunting buffaloes, bringing in the hides and meat, unloading the horses." Tom and me moved forward a little so we could see the camp, too. 5 or 6 men were unloading skins and meat from nearly 10 horses. From their size and the way they moved, I reckon 2 of them was Hog-Face and he who fears his mother-in-law. They was wearing the same red feathers, but no war paint. Blue Fox warn't with them, I was sure. Then I sees Jim, no doubt about it, sitting cross-legged on the ground by a thick post. There is a long rope, one end tied to his neck, the other to the post. He's tied up like a dog, but he don't seem unhappy. He's smiling at the Injuns as they pile up skins in front of him. They is heavy and slick, smeared with red and black blood. Jim has a tool in each hand for the scraping. He starts to clean the hides, and he doesn't seem too unhappy to do the work. 2 women and a child are moving around the packs of meat. They have black hair and are wearing skin dresses, so I don't reckon they be prisoners. I see no sign of Peggy or Flaxie. While I'm seeing all this, Brace and Tom don't say a word. It's getting dark. The sun is already down. We won't be able to watch the camp much longer. Finally, Brace says, "They won't hurt Jim. They needs him to work the hides. They fetched up some family when they joined the other Injuns, where we saw all them dead buffaloes. The women moving the meat is Injun too. Maybe the white woman and Flaxie has been traded off." Just then we see some people coming out of the brush hut. 2 girls scrambling to get to their feet, and a man with a stick close behind. He hits the bigger girl. She's wearing a skin covering like an old elk hide with a hole in the middle for the head to fit through. Not much of a dress. The littler girl is in front wearing a cloth dress, tan in color like the one Flaxie was wearing when they carried her off. I look closer. The light is no good. Her hair might be brown. I believe Flaxie is the one I'm looking at. Then I looks closer at the one behind her. Her hair looks brown too. I thought she was Injun because she was wearing the skin. Now I think she is white too. I don't dare guess that it might be Peggy. Pretty soon it's too dark to see, even with the Injuns building fires to cook up a mess of meat. We crawl back into the thickest part of the bushes to talk about what we seed. Brace is the first to talk. I think the first one who crawled from the hut is Flaxie. She was wearing a dress like that when they carried her off, I says. I think the second one was an Injun, Tom says, not wanting Brace to think the second girl might be Peggy. Her hair looked brown, not black, I argues. But she was wearing a skin dress, Tom says. The Injun hit her with a stick, Brace says, like she was his dog. She might be the white woman who made that track we saw. Her dress got tore up, so they gave her a skin, maybe. I didn't say any more. I didn't care none where all this talk was taking us. It was time for someone to ask if the girl might be Peggy, and I weren't going to get it started. I looked at Tom and nodded for him to talk. He shook his head and stayed quiet. Both of us reached in our pockets for some food and started chewing on dry meat. Brace didn't want to ask the next question either, so all three of us was quiet for a long time, chewing and looking into the night. I would like a fire, but with the Injun camp so near, we couldn't risk that. It warn't too cold anyways. After watching the Injuns cook meat over 2 or 3 fires, we just curled up in the bushes and tried to sleep while Brace figured out a plan. It was quiet until Brace says, "You boys sure it was Peggy you buried back there?" I was glad it was so dark that he weren't able to see my face. Tom was the one who could never stay quiet very long, so I guess if I says nothing, pretty soon Tom won't be able to stand the silence and have to talk. Besides, he'd already told me what he was going to say to explain it all. Tom surprised me, saying something totally different that I didn't expect he'd say at all. Course, we thought it was Peggy, that woman we buried. We was the ones who saw Peggy dragged off by the Injuns, so it was only natural to think she were the dead woman. But the one we buried had her face gashed in by a tomahawk, and it had been that way for a couple of days, and was swollen something awful, and covered with maggots and flies. Didn't look like the face of Peggy or any other woman I ever saw, but I thought it was the tomahawk and the swelling that made her look different. Then Brace asks, "What about the rest of her? Was she wearing Peggy's dress? Was she about the same shape, size, weight? You knows what I mean. Did the whole person look like Peggy?" Tom didn't answer right off. In the dark, I couldn't see his face to know if he was stumped or just thinking up something else to say. Finally, he says, "The Injun stole her clothes. Even with her dead, it didn't seem decent to look at her. We was embarrassed when we seed her, so we looked away. After we digged the hole, we tied our shirts on her faces so we couldn't look at her while we lifted her in and pushed the dirt on top of her. We didn't look at her enough to know she warn't Peggy." "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Brace asked, his voice all broken up and sobbing. Tom didn't even hesitate before he says, "You telled us not to say anything except we done it. We knowed how much you loved her. The more we says, the more you'd hurt. We know you'd never forget anything we says, and if we tells what we saw, you'd see pictures in your head that would never go away. So we says hardly nothing. We thought you would want to remember her the way you last saw her, not the way we last saw her." Suddenly, Brace was between us, squeezing us near to death with his splendid, powerful arms, loving us, telling us we was wonderful boys and the best friends a man ever had. His cheeks was wet with smeared tears. He said he was sorrowful he had brung us to Injun country and hoped we warn't going to die. I hoped I warn't going to die either, and Tom too, because someday he would make a mighty fine lawyer. He could tell a lie better than all the folks I'd ever met and never hoped to meet. I know if I ever got in trouble with the law, I would want Tom to be my lawyer. "What will we do?" I asked. Brace, he says, "I thought of the 3 of us a-going to Fort Laramie and fetching the soldiers." "That's a splendid idea," Tom says. He was talking real fast. "It would take maybe a week to get there," Brace explained. "Another week to get back. The Injuns would be gone by then, and if a storm rolled in, the tracks would be gone too. If that's Peggy down there, I darsn't leave her again, even to fetch a gang of soldiers." "A gang of soldiers might have a better chance to save her than one man and two boys," Tom argued. "I can't leave her," Brace says. "We will die," Tom says, his voice sounding awful scared. "I might die, but you boys will stay here on the hill. If the Injuns catches me, then you two skedaddle back to the mules and race to Fort Laramie." "We don't know where she is, Fort Laramie," I says. "Shouldn't we go back the way we come to the United States?" Then Brace says, "Laramie is closest. Easy to find. Ride southwest, the morning sun on the back of your left shoulder, the evening sun on your right cheek. When you reach the North Platte, you'll see plenty of wagon tracks, signs of stock grazing. Don't cross the river, just follow it up. Should take near a week. With the soldiers, you be safe. They'll help you get home." "So you be thinking you can fight all them Injuns by yourself?" I says. "I hope not," Brace says. "I'm hoping the bucks will go hunting again, take some of the women and older children with them. Then I can just saunter in and fetch Peggy and Flaxie and Jim and maybe shoot any Injun who has a different idea. When the men comes back from hunting, their horses will be wore out and we'll have us a 20-mile head start for Laramie." "What if they don't go hunting?" Tom asks. "If I knows anything about Injuns, they will hunt all they can before the buffaloes move on. Once they finds a herd, they usually goes out every day until they can't find no more buffaloes. Only one thing bothers me." "Tell us," Tom says. "They has just one bush hut, no skin lodges. This ain't no regular camp, like they was going someplace, maybe taking Peggy and Flaxie and Jim to the home camp, but they comes on these buffaloes and decides to go hunting. This ways they might be in a hurry to get home and not go hunting again. If this happens, my plan won't work." I noticed that Brace was no longer talking as if the white woman might be Peggy. He had decided the woman was Peggy. I hoped his plan would work. We was tired, but sleep warn't easy to come by. We didn't know who might be dead or alive by the next time it got dark. Finally, I just gives up trying to sleep and looks up at the stars, wondering what it might be like to be dead. Chapter 10. At first light, we crawls out of the bushes and hides behind some rocks on the ridge where we got a clear view of the camp and the grazing horses. When we was following the trail a few days earlier, Brace thought white men was traveling with the Injuns because some of the horses was wearing iron shoes. But that warn't so. There warn't no white men in the camp. The horses with shoes was the ones Peggy's family had brung with them, some mules too. The squaws in the camp were the first to stir about, starting the fires, cooking meat to eat. One sauntered down by the stream, a big knife in her hand, and begun cutting willows. I asked Brace if she was cutting willows to whip the prisoners. He said no, that they was only going to tie the willow sticks together into racks so they could dry the meat they had brung in the night before. One of the squaws took a side of ribs over to Jim, who was already awake and scraping the hides they had brung him the day before. He didn't seem very unhappy, though the rope from the post was still tied around his neck. It warn't like he was really a prisoner, because he could easy cut the rope with the scraping tool in his hand. I knowed it was plenty sharp by the way he sliced the ribs away from each other. He seemed one happy slave with more ribs than a man could eat at one time. Then I noticed someone coming out of the bush lodge. It was Blue Fox, and he was pulling someone else along with him. It was the white girl, the one who was wearing the skin, the girl we thought might be Peggy. Behind her, the little girl followed, the one we thought was Flaxie. I just knowed it was them sisters, though we was too far a distance to see their faces. Blue Fox dragged Peggy over to a big hind quarter of buffalo meat and shoved her to the ground. Then I thought my eyes was fooling me, because I could not believe what happened next. Old Blue Fox pulled a big skinning knife out of his belt and aimed it right at Peggy's heart. At the same time, Brace was scrambling for his rifle. We was too far away for a clean shot, but Brace wasn't about to let Peggy die without trying something. Just as Brace were about to shoot, Blue Fox spins the knife around in his hand and hands it to Peggy. Now she has the knife. Brace lowers his rifle. In a glance, I see big drops of sweat on his forehead, but I have to look back at Peggy. I no longer feel bad about her not having the dirk Brace gave her when he tried to make her promise to stick it in her heart if the Injuns catched her. I reckon now she could do it with the big knife if she warn't too afraid. I kept thinking she should stick it in Blue Fox's heart instead, now she had the chance. She did neither one. She turned away from Blue Fox and starts cutting on the buffalo leg. Flaxie crouches down to help. "She's cutting meat for drying," Brace whispered. He didn't say anything about the dirk and how he wanted Peggy to kill herself if she could. She could do it now, easy as stabbing a frog, and I sure hoped she wouldn't. But I didn't ask Brace if he still wanted her to do it. I figured if she was going to do that, she would have done it already. I didn't ask about it because now we had other fish to fry, like getting her and Flaxie and Jim out of there. The Injuns didn't go catching the horses as we reckoned they would. Brace was wrong. They was not going hunting again. The men sat in a circle around a big slab of buffalo meat, talking and laughing and eating, while mending bows and arrows. The squaws pulled and cut strips of meat to dry on the racks. Jim looked like he was whistling a happy tune while scraping the flesh and fat off the hides, but I can't hear none of it. Some children played by the creek. I reckon the scene in front of us was just like in the pages of Tom's books. Splendid, happy savages putting up meat against the winter, innocent and happy as Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. But we know different. They murdered a whole family of fine, nice people, then stole the girls and mules. Ain't no way around it. Blue Fox, Hogface, and Man Afraid of His Mother-in-Law were wicked men. And I hoped Brace would kill them all, except maybe the squaws and children. Then Tom says, "What do we do now?" "You and Huck shut up while I think up a new plan," Brace says. So we be quiet for maybe 2 hours. Seemed like 2 days. Brace didn't think as fast as Tom. It would be a mistake if Brace decided to be a lawyer. Finally, he says, "You boys go back to the mules. Saddle up, load the packs, then come back here. Keep out of sight of the Injuns. Come slow so you get here about dark. Make sure the mules have plenty to eat and drink." We nodded that we understood. Then Brace says, "As soon as it's too dark for the Injuns to see me coming down the hill, I'll go straight to their horses, cutting the hobbles and tether ropes, then whooping and hollering like I was other Injuns just wanting to steal horses. Then I'll hide in the bushes while they runs after their ponies. Soon as they go by, I'll run the other way into camp to fetch the girls and Jim. We'll climb up here where you are waiting with the animals ready to go. We'll ride all night straight for Laramie, hoping it takes that long for the Injuns to round up their ponies and plan what to do." We left while Brace was sewing more bugs onto his shirt. Tom and I saddled the mules and went back to the top of the hill. Brace's plan seemed sensible enough. Tom couldn't think of anything better. I wondered why Brace was still sewing on more bugs. That didn't seem part of the plan, but he knew more about Injuns than me, so I kept quiet. The sun was already down now, and Brace wandered off down the hill. Pretty soon we couldn't see him no more. We supposed he were edging his way towards the grazing ponies. He had taken his guns with him. We tied the horses and mules in the brush patch, then hurried to the rocky ledge so we could better see the Injun camp. There were a whole lot of willow racks that the squaws had built during the day. Strips of meat hanging to dry were covering all the racks. Jim was still scraping happily away at his hides. Peggy and Flaxie had finished cutting up the big hind leg and were crouched by one of the fires cooking some pieces of meat to eat. Beyond the camp, we could see 15 or 16 horses and mules grazing quietly. 2 more horses were tied to a tree near the brush hut, so the Injuns would have them to round up the others. When it was almost too dark to see, Blue Fox herded Peggy and Flaxie into the brush hut. He followed them inside. Pretty soon all we could see was the fires and bodies moving back and forth in front of them. There was a sliver of moon over our heads, so we can see the close stuff like our mules and horses. The fires are still burning while the Injuns cook more meat when we hear Brace whooping and hollering way off beyond the fires. We can only guess that the horses are stampeding away from the camp because we can't see anything that far away. Pretty soon there are no more Injuns by the fires. We reckon Brace and Peggy and Jim and Flaxie will come running up the hill any minute. We tighten the cinches on all the saddles. The mules are filled up with grass and water. We is ready to run all the way to Fort Laramie. We wait and wait and wait. We drink some water and chew on dried meat. We ain't sleepy, though it's night, just knowing Brace and the prisoners might be coming right along and mad Injuns not far behind. Tom, he kept whispering this or that about all the things that might be happening in the Injun camp, or could happen, but it was just talk and I warn't listening, not much. Mostly I was just scared for Peggy and Flaxie, and what the Injuns might do to them if they catched them trying to get away. I figured Brace would be safe with all them bugs sewed on his shirt, and they wouldn't hurt Jim as long as there was hides to clean. But I worried about Peggy and Flaxie, more than about me and Tom. We was just boys who had run away and didn't count for anything in the world. We didn't go to school and we didn't work. Nobody would miss us if we didn't come back, though the widow Douglas might wonder why we didn't say goodbye when we sneaked away. They didn't come, not through the whole night. When it begun to get light, the squaws started fixing up the fires and cooking again like it was just any regular day. Nothing in the camp looks different. Jim is rustling through his hides, getting ready to go to work. We can't see Peggy and Flaxie, but reckon they're still in the hut. Then I sees the horses is back in the meadows, grazing just as happy as if they was in heaven. Tom and me, we are asking each other what has happened to Brace. Then we see him running through the willows along the stream. 3 Injuns is chasing him. 3 more is in front trying to cut him off. They is getting close on both ends. I reckon that if I was an Injun, I wouldn't want to get too close because Brace has his big bowie in his hand. But they tackles him anyways and wrestles away the knife. He smacks a couple of them in the faces, but pretty soon 2 big Injuns is holding his arms and there's no getting away. They drags him out of the willows and onto a grassy flat next to the camp. Some of the squaws and children runs over to see what their men has ketched. Brace, he's a squirmin' and wiggling and jerking to get free, but he ain't doing no good. The Injuns won't let go. When the squaws get there, they starts pointing at his shirt. I guess they sees the bugs he pinned there. Then the men sees the bugs. Everybody's pointing, talking, laughing like they never seen nothing like that before. Then Tom says, "Those is the dumbest Injuns I ever see, downright stupid." "How so?" I asks without looking away. "Don't they know only crazy men has bugs on their shirts? They is supposed to let him go. Any idiot knows that. What's wrong with these Injuns?" I had no answer for Tom's question. I believed Brace when he said Injuns wouldn't harm him if he sewed bugs on his shirt. But I also knowed if I was an Injun and caught an enemy trying to run off my horses, I wouldn't let him go because he had a bug on his shirt, even if he had lots of bugs on his shirt. And it didn't look like these Injuns was going to let their man go either. But they did wrestle his shirt off and hang it real careful over a bush so the bugs wouldn't be harmed and where everybody could look it over. While they do this, Brace is still squirming to get away. Finally, they get tired of holding him up, so they pushes him down on the ground, his face in the dirt. While 2 of the big ones is holding his arms, the rest grab his legs and pull his boots off. When they is done with that, the one that looks like Blue Fox grabs one of Brace's feet, and using the bowie they just wrestled away from Brace, he cuts through the big tendon behind his ankle just above the heel. Then he does the same thing to the other foot. When he's done, all the Injuns jump away. Brace gets up and tries to run, but he falls down because his feet ain't connected to the muscles no more. The Injuns laugh to have such fine sport. Brace gets up again. This time he don't try to run. He stumbles over to a dead tree at the edge of the grass and picks up a club big enough to smash a man's head. The Injuns is all excited and runs to make a circle around their prisoner, out of reach of the big club. Then I says to Tom, "Maybe if we start shooting they will come after us so Brace can get away." "I don't want to die," Tom says. He is sobbing so hard I can hardly understand his words. Big tears is washing his cheeks. I never seen Tom Sawyer cry afore. I never knowed he could do that. He don't give a hoot that I see him either. I see now that things change when you think you's gonna die. Then Tom says, "If we shoots at them, they'll kill us like they is doing to Brace." "Brace ain't dead yet. He will be, and us too, if we don't leave right now and ride as fast as we can to Fort Laramie." "I want to help Brace, but I don't know what to do," I says, beginning to cry too. "I don't care much about leaving Peggy and Flaxie either." Then Tom says, "Maybe the soldiers can save them. If we rides fast enough, that's the only way." So I says, "I can't leave Brace and Peggy like this." "We can stay and fight," Tom explains, getting a better handle on his voice. "Or we can run. If we fights, we dies. If we runs, maybe the soldiers will save Peggy and Flaxie and Jim and bury Brace. Besides, we is only boys. Nobody expects us to fight a whole band of Injuns just so we can get killed and be heroes." I don't know why it was that Tom was always right when he had a different idea on what to do. I suppose he was just a lot smarter than me. After listening to Tom, I knowed it was right to run to the fort and to save ourselves if we could. But when Tom crawled over to his mule to untie the reins, I didn't go with him. I could not take my eyes off Brace and the Injuns that were now trying to take away his club. He swung hard at the ones that got too close, but they always seemed quick enough to jump back so he would miss. I couldn't see how much his feet was bleeding, but I knowed they was. He didn't have no boots on, so I guessed his feet was pretty sore as he jumped around trying to hit the Injuns with his club. It was a game he warn't a-goin' to win. He couldn't run anywhere even if he clubbed half of them to death. If the Injuns got tired of their game, they could shoot him full of arrows. Then I saw some movement by the bush hut. Peggy and Flaxie were outside and running to brace. Peggy was in front, running the fastest and full of enough pluck to fight all the Injuns at one time. There was no knife or club or gun in her hands, so I guessed she was just going to save Brace with her bare hands. Flaxie was running as fast as she could just to keep up. Here was Tom and me with enough guns and ammo for 5 or 6 men, and we was scared to do anything. Where did the world come off thinking boys was braver than girls? Peggy had more pluck than both of us together, then some. Tom would say she was brave because she was going to marry Brace, because he was her fiancé. We didn't have to wait long to find out what the Injuns thought of Peggy. One of the bucks tackles her, grabs her by the hair, and begins dragging her back to her bush house. He walks so fast, Peggy is stumbling along to keep from falling down. Flaxie is close behind, yelling and throwing rocks at the man who is dragging her sister. I don't know which of the girls is the bravest. Girls were supposed to be afraid of Injuns, but these two weren't one little bit. About this time, a couple more Injuns shows up, riding their ponies and swinging ropes. The horses has white man saddles so the riders can dally if they catches something. One of them ropes Brace around the neck and shoulder. Before the white man can slip out of the loop, the Injun has dallied and spun his pony around. He jerks Brace to the ground and drags him across the grass. Brace lets go of his club. The second Injun rides in close behind Brace and throws down a loop so Brace can be dragged into it. When this Injun finally pulls his rope tight, all he catches is a foot, but that is good enough. He dallies and gallops forward to race side by side with the first Injun, poor Brace between them, flip-flopping like a fresh-caught catfish just throwed up on the bank. They drags him over rocks and bushes as fast as their ponies can run. When they finally brings him back, Brace has no more fight in him. He lays there, torn and bloody, between the two ponies. The two Injuns gets down to the ground and start cutting at the top of Brace's head, collecting his scalp. When they is done, one stands tall, holding Brace's hair high above his head, yelling a war cry, just like the Injuns in the circus. Suddenly, Brace is on his feet, wrapping his arm around the neck of the Injun who's been yelling, pushing his head forward until the neck is busted. About this time, the other Injun sinks a tomahawk into the back of Brace's head. Now I guess he is dead, and so is the Injun whose neck he broke. Both go down and don't move no more. The Injuns is fighting mad now. Brace has spoiled their party. He wasn't supposed to kill nobody. Brace is too dead for them to hurt him, but they have to try, so they jab sticks into his eyes, then cuts off his ears and privates. Then they digs into his chest and gets his heart out. Blue Fox holds it high. I can't watch no more. I falls on the ground feeling like I was going to lose my breakfast when I feel Tom pull at my shirt. He says, "We must be gone now. Get on your mule." "No, I won't go." "You have to." "Says who?" "Tom Sawyer." "Tom, you ain't no boss of me. 2 girls and Jim needs saving. I can't go." "You're only a boy. How can you save those girls and Jim too?" "Don't know." "You'll die just like Brace and the rest of the Mills family." "Might be so, but I stays." "You can't do no good for Peggy now." "Maybe I can." "She's been violated," he says. I don't know what that means. I reckon I never heard that word before. I knowed a cabin without chinking was ventilated and that a delicate little purple flower was a violet, but I'd never heard the word violated, so I says, "What does that mean?" "It means defiled," Tom says. I didn't think this was a good time for Tom to be the smart boy, using words an ordinary person could not understand, but it was Tom's way when he wanted everybody to think he was smarter than them. "I don't know what that means either," I says, willing to be the dummy, maybe for the last time. "It means them Injuns has ruined her, not once but maybe 100 times. That's why Brace wished her dead and gave her the dirk so she could kill herself if the Injuns ketched her. To be defiled is worse than being dead, so she ain't worth being saved no more." "But what about Flaxie and Jim?" I asks. "Brace hisself said they won't hurt Flaxie and Jim, so there's plenty of time to get to the fort and send the soldiers to save them." By now I think I'd figured out what them big words meant. I could see what Tom was saying, but I still couldn't reckon why Peggy warn't worth saving no more. We had seen her walking around the camp, cutting up meat, taking care of Flaxie, fighting Blue Fox to save Brace. Tom reckoned that violating and defiling with Injuns made her worth no more than a three-legged dog, that she was no longer the Peggy we knew. None of it made sense to me. I'd seen dogs, pigs, and slaves doing Tom's violating and defiling business, but I couldn't see it made any difference in who they was or what they was worth. They was the same afterwards as before, although sometimes a baby or litter would come along, but the ones that done it was still the same. "I'll leave your mule behind," Tom says as he mounts up. "No, one mule by hisself would make such a fuss the Injuns'll catch me for sure. I'll just keep this here rifle," I says, running my hand up and down the cold barrel of the .40 caliber Hawken I'd loaded the night before. After throwing down some dried meat, powder, lead, and a bunch of them lucifer fire sticks wrapped in oilcloth, Tom rides off without saying goodbye, and all the mules follows him. I turns away to look more at the Injun camp. The squaws is all crying over the dead Injun, which I now thinks is Hogface. To feel better, some of them picks up sticks and starts whipping on Brace, but I don't reckon he cares now he is dead. The men picks up stout sticks and starts scraping out a hole. If I was Brace, I don't think I would want to be buried with Hogface. The Injuns is only digging one hole, but a really big one, so I thinks both men'll go in together, either side by side or one on top of the other. But I is wrong again. When the hole is digged, they don't throw Brace in with the Injun. Instead, they slit the throat of a fine black pony. When it finally falls down and stops kicking, they roll it to the bottom of the hole, then they rolls old Hogface down next to its back. I remembers Tom telling me how Injuns buries their dead on pole racks that looks like skinny beds with long legs above the ground. I see again how these real Injuns don't do things the same as Tom's book Injuns. But I reasons if I was an Injun out in the middle of the Great Plains where trees don't grow much, I wouldn't want to ride 1,000 miles just so I could make a pole bed to hold up a dead man. And I would not want to make a tree bed to hold up a dead horse, neither. Once they puts Hogface and his pony in the hole, they don't hurry to cover him up. The men wait while some of the squaws goes back to camp to gather up stuff to bury with Hogface. They throws in his bow and a quiver of arrows, a knife, a pipe and some tobacco, a parfleche of dried meat, a skin full of water, then covers all of it with a big sleeping robe. Then they throws on the dirt. They makes the top of the hole as smooth as they can, then leads horses back and forth to tramp it in, then wipes away the tracks with branches. No marker. If you warn't there when they covered him up, you would never know a man was buried there. But I knowed. If I ever wanted a bow and all them arrows or that knife, I would know exactly where to dig to get them things. Maybe I would do that when the Injuns moved on. As for Brace, after they was done with the hacking and slicing, they just tied a rope on his leg. One of the Injuns got on a saddled horse and dragged Brace beyond one of the near hills out of sight and just left him there for the birds and wolves to finish him off. I knowed I'd have sneaked down there at night and give him a proper burial, but I knowed if the body was suddenly gone, no more birds circling in the sky, the Injuns would want to know why. They would sniff around and maybe track me to my hiding place. I hoped Brace would understand why I couldn't bury him. Not now, anyways. Chapter 11. Now some of the men goes out in the meadow catching horses. Women is packing up some of the dried meat in rawhide parfleches, which looks like big white envelopes like the ones Aunt Polly mails letters in. I think maybe the Injuns is getting ready to move camp, but it warn't so. Instead, the men is getting ready to go hunting for buffaloes again. I guess they seen some whiles they was out chasing the horses Brace had run off. Men are gathering up bows and arrows and smearing paint on their ponies after they catches them. They draws red circles around the eyes, blue handprints on the hips, and yellow wiggly lines in other places. I guess they is putting on the war paint for the buffaloes they want to kill. After the men has rode off, the women gets together, gathers up a bunch of the hides, some of the ones Jim has been scraping, and spreads them out on the ground so the hairs is on the top. Then they takes ashes from the fires where they was cooking and scoops them into buffalo stomach buckets, then adds water so they can stir the ashes into a thick black soup, which they pours over the hair on the buffalo skins, then they rolls them up. They carries the rolled skins down to the creek and throws them in at the deepest place. I just can't figure why these Injuns is so dumb. After working so hard to clean up the skins, they just gets them all dirty again, then throws them away in the river. Jim is over by his post cleaning more hides, like he doesn't even care that the squaws are just going to get them dirty and throw them away. After a while, Peggy and Flaxie comes out of their brush teepee. After going over in some bushes and squatting, they goes to one of the fires and starts cooking up some meat to eat. I can't see if Peggy is still crying about what happened to Brace, but I guess she is. Maybe Flaxie, too. Still, they have the good sense to get something in their stomachs. They looks fine to me, but I'm far away and only guessing. I wish as I could talk to them just for a minute. But if I could, I should have a plan to tell them about, how I'm going to help them run away. But I don't have no plan. I wish as Tom didn't leave. He could think up a plan better than any boy I ever knowed. But Tom warn't around no more, so I decides I must talk to Peggy. Maybe she can help me think up a plan. I remembers from watching the camp that during the warmer times of the day the squaws santers down to the creek to wash or to fetch water, sometimes to take baths. Peggy and Flaxie goes down there too sometimes. So I creeps down the backside of my hill, out of sight of the Injuns, and sneaks around to the backside of the little creek, and hides myself in some thick willow bushes. I find me a spot where I can see most of the parts of the stream where the women washes and gets their water. I roused out an army of ordinary mosquitoes in the willows, but I dare not slap at them, fearful the Injuns might see me move or hear the slapping. With so many bugs wanting to suck my blood, I don't know how long I can wait for Peggy. Then I see some wild onions and remembers Jim telling me how slaves living by swamps rubs onion tops on their skins to keep the bugs away. I pulls up a handful of the green tops, crushes them in my hands, then smears them over the parts of my skin where the mosquitoes wants to do their sucking. Pretty soon there are no more mosquitoes around me, and the bonus is that the onions smells a mite good and make me feel hungry. So I chews on some dried meat while I watches for Peggy and Flaxie. Pretty soon the squaws and children start coming down to the stream. The men are gone and most of the chores is done, so it's now a lazy, hot summer afternoon. Everybody wants to be by the cool water. The children just runs in the water and starts playing, but when the squaws starts pulling off their dresses, I feels mighty embarrassed and feels some blushes coming on. I know some boys who likes to hide in the bushes to watch women change clothes or swim, but there's still enough boy in me that I feel more embarrassed than curious, except maybe when Peggy finally comes down to join the squaws. Flaxie is with her, but these white girls is more civilized. When Flaxie pulls off her dress and Peggy tosses aside the big skin that covers her, they both is wearing their white cotton underslips, which they leaves on when they goes into the creek. Most of the squaws just sits around rubbing sand on the parts they want to clean. The children are splashing and playing. Peggy isn't any closer than the rest to me, so I don't know how I can talk to her, so all I do is wait, try not to enjoy the watching too much as the embarrassing feelings gradually go away. What surprises me is that now I'm close in, Peggy looks as gentle and sweet as she did before her folks was killed, except her eyes is a little red where she was rubbing them. She looks more sad than before, but even that makes her more pretty. Like I can look at her all the day long and never get tired of it. She makes me feel like I could have just stay in them willows and look at her for the rest of my life. I reckon she might look a little older because of the hard life with the Injuns, being outside a lot and the defiling, but she's still the same Peggy, making me feel like the sun has not come up until I can see her face. I feel happy again for the first time since her folks was killed. It's a relaxing, peaceful condition, watching Peggy and Flaxie, and them squaws and children playing and bathing in the cool water. Before I knows it, I falls asleep, and I sleeps for hours, because when I finally wakes up, most of the squaws and children are gone and the sun is getting low in the sky. But Peggy and Flaxie is there, sitting on the grassy bank, still in their white underslips, trying to comb each other's hair with forked sticks. The two squaws who are watching them have their backs to me, so I stands up and waves at Peggy, hoping to catch her attention. When one of the squaws starts to turn around, I drops down behind the willows again, but Peggy, she sees me. After a time, she gets up, telling Flaxie to stay put, then wanders into the stream, seeming not to go in any particular direction, but as she wanders around, she is getting closer and closer. One of the squaws leaves to go back to the camp. Now there's only one lookout, and she's sitting at the edge of the water, her back towards me. Finally, Peggy is close enough to talk. She whispers, "Huckleberry Finn, what are you doing here? You must leave. They'll kill you too." Her voice is sad, but still it is angel music. "Me and Tom came with Brace to save you," I whispers back. "Tom's gone to Fort Laramie to fetch soldiers. You and Flaxie and Jim can sneak away with me. We can go to the fort, maybe meet the soldiers before we gets there." "Too late to save me," she says. "Too late, way too late. They'll kill you like they did Brace." I wondered what she meant about it being too late to save her. She looked alive and well and as pretty as ever, though maybe a little older. There was creases in her brow that I never seen before. Then she says, "You should have left with Tom. Didn't want to leave you and Flaxie and Jim." "Nobody wants to kill us," she says, a scolding sound in her voice like a mad schoolteacher. "But they will kill a boy like you in a second. Now get out of here, shoo." The squaw hears Peggy talking and turns around as I duck down, my heart hurting that a white girl called me a boy, and I can't reckon why. I know Jim hated being called a boy by white men, and never did understand that either. Plenty of folks called me boy, but it never did hurt until Peggy done it. Some things a boy just ain't about to understand, like why Peggy says it's too late to save her when she looks more alive and wonderful than she ever looked before. "Shoo, you rascal, get," Peggy says, kicking at the water like she is trying to drive off a snake or a turtle. The squaw watches a minute, then turns back to her regular position. "Which way's the fort?" Peggy whispers. "Southwest," I says, pointing in that direction. "When you strike the North Platte, follow the wagon tracks west." "If the men don't come back, maybe we can sneak away when it gets dark," she says. "I'll be up there," I says, pointing to the hill where Tom and me was hiding. "Bring some dried meat. It might take a week or more to find the soldiers. I reckon we can travel at night and hide when it's light. No horses, we got to walk." "Look for us after dark on the hill," she says, turning and wading back to Flaxie. I wish she didn't have to go, but knowed it was best. When the women was gone, I sneaks out of the willows and goes back to the top of the hill, being real careful to keep out of sight of the village. The sun is still shining as I gathers up all my stuff, so I will be ready the minute the girls and Jim comes up. I just hopes they can get away without somebody chasing them. Chapter 12. The sun is just getting ready to go down when I sees a big cloud of dust beyond the little hill where they dragged Brace. I gets a sick feeling in my stomach, because I knows the Injuns is likely coming home early. I hopes the dust is being made by buffaloes or wild horses, but I knows different in my heart. Pretty soon I see the Injuns riding into sight, but they ain't alone. 2 white men and a bunch of mules with packs is riding with them. The white men looks like trappers, dressed just like the Injuns in buckskin shirts and leggings, but I knows they is white because they both have bushy beards on their faces, and their clothes is dirtier than those of the Injuns. The whites is too far away to see real good, but one of them is wearing a black and white hat. My eyes can see that for sure. A skunk hat it is. It puzzles me why a man would want a skunk on his head, unless maybe he is a skunk himself. The other white man doesn't have any hat at all, just long brown hair. Both men is taller than the Injuns, but one is fat and the other skin and bones. Both is carrying long rifles across the front of their saddles. They is herding the pack mules like cows with no lead ropes tied to their halters. The Injuns is all excited, making circles around the white men. Some is yelling and waving their bows and arrows. This is the same Injuns that went hunting earlier. The painted horses tell me this. I guess when they found these white men, they changed their minds about hunting buffaloes. I don't know why the Injuns is so excited to be bringing home 2 white men. I just knows that with all these men around it will be harder, maybe impossible, for the girls and Jim to sneak away. Pretty soon the whole camp is getting ready for a big party. Lots of wood is throwed on the fires. Women is cooking meat. The white men pull some bottles from one of their packs. The fat one with the skunk hat yanks the cork from one of the bottles and lets the Injuns take turns swallowing down the contents. I can see all the Injuns. Only Peggy and Flaxie is staying in the bush teepee. Jim is leaning against his pole, watching the party, maybe wondering if he will get a turn to suck from the bottle. I can't see much after it gets dark, but the fires keeps burning, and there's lots of noises, mostly yelling and laughing. Sometimes a gun is fired. I waits all night, sleeping in short dozes. The girls and Jim never come. When it gets light, I see the two white men and Blue Fox sitting in a tight circle, talking real serious. Other Injuns is standing back, watching their business. I can't guess what their talk might be until some of the Injuns goes to the bush teepee and fetches Peggy. She don't want no part of this business as they drag her over to the white men. I reckon she knows they ain't come to save her, and I don't know how she knows that. When the one with the skunk hat tries to lift up Peggy's skin to look underneath, she kicks him in the chest so he falls over backwards. Instead of getting mad, he just laughs and takes another drink from one of the bottles. He and Blue Fox start talking again, while the other Injuns holds on to Peggy. As I watch these white men do business with the Injuns, I thinks these are the kinds of men my pappy would want to ride with if he was still alive. I check my rifle. It's ready to fire. I don't know what to do except watch. Finally, the white man gets up and walks around like their business is done. The Injuns helps them catch their horses and mules, except 2 mules which they leave in the meadow. When everything is ready for them to leave, they take Peggy away from the Injuns who is holding her and try to put her on one of the mules, but she won't do it. My gentle, sweet Peggy, she bites one of them on the arm, then starts hitting and kicking like a wildcat. I can't figure out why she wants so bad to stay with the Injuns who has killed her folks in Brace. These white men might even take her to Fort Laramie where she could get away from them and be safe. Pretty soon they stops trying to put Peggy on the mule. Some Injuns hold on to her while the 2 white men and Blue Fox starts another round of business talk, passing one of them bottles back and forth as they do it. Then after a while, one of the white men gets up and starts taking some more bottles out of one of the mule packs. He gives them to Blue Fox, who yells something towards the bush teepee. Pretty soon little Flaxie comes out of the teepee and runs to Peggy. They starts hugging. Now I figures out what is happening. Peggy warn't about to leave with the white men unless Flaxie could go with her. That's why she made all the fuss and bit the man. That Peggy warn't about to leave her little sister behind. Pretty soon the white men help Peggy and Flaxie get on a mule, Peggy in front. Then all of them leaves while the Injuns is opening up the new bottles and having a grand time passing them around. The white men warn't headed east towards the United States, but in a southwestward direction towards Fort Laramie. The trail would be easy to follow, but without anything to ride, I guessed I would have a hard time keeping up with them. After a while, one of the Injuns takes a bottle over to old Jim, who is sitting by his post, and gives Jim a sip. Jim nods his head and smiles like he is mighty grateful. Pretty soon the Injun unties Jim's tether rope and lets him come back to the main group. Jim struts around like he is mighty proud they let him leave his post. I watch him a long time. I want to be following Peggy and Flaxie, but Jim and me have been like brothers almost as long as I remembers. On the big river he saved me a time or two, and I saved him too. I warn't about to leave him with these mean Injuns, not without talking some. I decides as soon as it is dark again I will sneak down to Jim's post and ask him if he wants me to save him from the Injuns and let him run away with me. He can maybe help me save Peggy and Flaxie from the white men. While waiting for dark to set in, I watch what is happening in the Injun camp when not taking naps. I have plenty of meat and dried biscuits, stuff Tom had left for me, but I ain't much hungered. Usually a boy like me eats everything around, but not now. I reckon being scared makes me not want to eat. I wish as I could be brave like Brace and stop thinking what these Injuns might do if they catches me, the kind of thinking that makes my hands quiver like a hog's belly on a hot day. Then I think about Peggy, how she looks and talks, and how I feel when she talks to me. Then I feel less scared, but I still ain't hungry. I wish as Tom was around so he could explain my feelings. Tom could explain most anything. He could tell me why I no longer felt like eating all the time. As I watched the camp, I see one of the squaws is near Jim, more than the rest. She is bringing him things to eat and drink, and sometimes she just sits by him as she cuts and sews on pieces of skin. Sometimes she holds a piece of skin against Jim's foot. I reckon she is making him his own moccasins. I guess Jim is real pleased that she is doing it. I am glad in late afternoon when Jim returns to his post and starts cleaning skins again. I guess the Injuns stays away from there, mostly because the skins stink, it being summer and all. But that squaw still comes over and checks his feet once in a while. The rest of the Injuns seems to be going to bed early. When it's dark, I sneaks down the hill. I'm glad these Injuns has no dogs. They would see and smell me for sure and start barking, me crawling through the grass and getting close, but they don't have no dogs, so I don't worry about that. "Jim," I whispers when I's about a rod away. "Who dat?" he whispers back. There's still enough light from the fires that I can see him looking towards me, but he can't see me because I am holding still in the grass, flat on my belly. "It's me, Huck," I says. "If that don't beat all," he sings. I move in close so we don't have to talk so loud. "Me think you scalped with them Mills boys," he says as he wraps his powerful arms around me and squeezes so hard I can't hardly breathe. "They warn't able to catch me and Tom," I says. I tells him how we waited for Brace, then followed the Injuns to this camp. "Tom here too?" he asks, gradually releasing his hold on me. "Tom's went to fetch the soldiers." "Dirty white men, they tell Injuns 'bout soldier boys, they gets Miss Peggy." "What?" "They tell Injuns soldier boys kill all Blue Fox people if they finds white woman. Give 'em 2 mules, too, so they can take Miss Peggy. Then 2 bottles of white lightning for Flaxy Girl, 'cause Miss Peggy won't go if she don't." "They take them girls to Fort Laramie?" I asks. "Nah, going trapping for beavers and other varmints all winter beyond Fort Laramie." "Why do they want the girls?" I asks. "They wants only Miss Peggy. The reason men wants women everywheres." "Defilin' and violatin'," I says in a sober voice, feeling angry instead of scared for the first time since I can remember. "Guess so, white men's calls it that." I's mad and ready to go after the girls, but I got to ask Jim something first. "Brace give Peggy a dirk to kill herself if them Injuns defiled her," I says. "He was sorry she hadn't done it. So was Tom, I thinks. I don't understand." "They reads too many books," Jim says, without seeming to give my question much thought. "I still don't understand," I says. "Book women and real women ain't same," he says. "If all the dark women that got violated by white boss men stuck dirks in their hearts, no women be left over to have the babies. No more slaves to pick the cotton. No more slaves for abolitionists to set free. Real women don't do that, that's all." Jim hadn't been to school like Tom and Brace, and didn't even know how to read, but he was the wisest man in the world that I knowed. Since leaving the United States, I learned that real Injuns and book Injuns ain't the same. Now I knowed real women and book women weren't the same either. "Run away with me, Jim," I says. "We got to save them girls." "I stays right here," he says. "This is mean, dangerous Injuns," I argues. "You can't want to stay here." "I is, Huck, and that's the solemn truth," he says. "I don't understand," I says. "These Injuns lets old Jim drink from the same bottle," he says. "No white man never done that, 'cept maybe Huck Finn. They don't call me boy and say do this and do that." "You don't belong here." "So old Jim goes to the fort," he says, like he is mad at me. "Soldier boys say Jim runs away, put chains on feet. Sends Jim back to Boss Man Plantation. Jim likes Injun camp better." "What about the girls?" I asks. He grins and says, "Jim tells Huck's secret." He leans forward and whispers, "Miss Peggy don't need no savin'. Maybe Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer do, not Miss Peggy." I don't know what he meaned by that. I don't understand why he wants to stay with them savages who murdered the Mills family, folks who was our friends. A minute before I thinks Jim as wise as Moses. Now I thinks he's plumb crazy. Then I hears something. Footsteps on rocks. Someone comin' like's an Injun. I dives under one of Jim's skins, hoping nobody has seed me. I has one end of the skin lifted up so I can see who's comin'. It's a squaw, the one that was making real Injun moccasins for old Jim. I don't think she sees me because she sits down by Jim and leans her head against his big arm, then closes her eyeballs like she don't have a worry in the whole world. She ain't said a single word, neither has old Jim. He put his big arm around her shoulders, then tells me to come out from under the skin. I does it. The squaw sees me and her eyeballs gets real big. She tries to get away, but Jim is holding her with his arm. His other hand is over her mouth so she can't yell to the other Injuns. After a minute, she looks up at Jim's face and sees he's happy and not scared like she is. Jim stops holding her like a prisoner. She don't try to run away or yell. She just looks at me as she sits real close to old Jim. no more scared. This story is continued on Disc 3. Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer Among the Indians by Mark Twain and Lee Nelson. Continued. Disc 3. She don't look real young or real old, not fat and not real skinny, just a squaw, kind of pretty, them black eyes sparkling like wet coal. Her long hair is tied in 2 neat braids. Her skin dress is clean except for rows of smashed porcupine quills. She smells like smoke. She leans against Jim, and his smile says he likes it. Jim learned me that when 2 people loves each other, it shows. It did here, in this Injun camp, in the middle of the night. "Then I go by myself," I says. Jim nods. I sneaks off in the night, gathers up my rifle and food, and hurries off in the same direction them 2 trappers took Peggy and Flaxie. Chapter 13. I'd never been out in a wilderness like this before, but I'd growed up in the woods, hunting, trapping, and fishing, and knowed something about following trails and tracks. Them trappers with Peggy and Flaxie weren't hard to follow. All them horses and mules left enough tracks that a baby could do it. I was worrisome that the Injuns might be following me. I looked over my shoulder a lot. At first I just traveled at night, but after a few days and not seeing anybody, not even any buffaloes, I just hiked along whenever I warn't sleeping. What seemed strange to me was that even though they was riding horses and mules and I was walking, I seemed to be catching up to them. The horse apples they left behind was getting wetter and wetter. After 4 or 5 days, I followed their trail to a pretty big river for this part of the country. It warn't very deep, but plenty wide. I figured it was the same Platte River we had been camped next to when the Mills family was slaughtered by the Injuns. There was plenty of wagon tracks and some awful deep ruts. Dust in some places. Lots of horse, mule, and ox tracks. The tracks from Peggy's bunch kind of mixed in with the others, so they was hard to follow now. But since all the tracks seemed to be going in the same direction, I just followed them all, thinking this was probably the road to Fort Laramie. Some of them tracks probably belonged to Tom and our mules, I guessed. 3 days later, I spots what I reckon is Fort Laramie off in the distance. I guess I'm safe from Injuns now, so I hurries up, right down the middle of the road, as fast as I can walk. I don't got a plan, just get to the fort and figure things out from there. I can't figure out why the trappers would pay good mules and whiskey for Peggy and Flaxie just to take them to a fort and set them free. It just didn't make sense unless the trappers was preachers or abolitionists who just rode around on their horses helping set folks free. But I never heard of people like that, at least not in this country, which is a long way from the United States. So I just hurries toward the fort, hoping Peggy will be there, and maybe Tom too. I'm about 2 miles off when I sees another person walking along the road in front of me, going the same direction but at a slower pace. I guess I might catch up before that person reaches the fort. As I get closer, it looks like the person in front of me is wearing a dress, so I guesses it is a female, a little one at that, a girl or a tiny, tiny woman. As I get over closer, I can see she has yellow hair, and the dress starts to look like one I has seen earlier on Flaxie. I starts to run and finally catches her just before we gets to the fort. It's Flaxie all right, and she's just a-crying as she walks along. She is so surprised to see me that she just doesn't know what to do. Finally, she sits down on the ground and cries some more. I sits down next to her and just strokes her on the back, trying to make her feel better. Finally, she starts to talk. She says, "They tell Peggy if she stops making trouble and promises to ride with them to their trapping camp, they will let me go. She agrees, so here I am walking by myself to this fort." "Where's Peggy now?" I asks. "With the trappers. They went another way to miss the fort. They thinks the soldiers might be looking for Peggy and me." "Any idea where they are going?" I asks. "One of them, a few days ago, when he didn't know I was listening, said something about their trapping camp being near Fort Bridger. They might be going there, but they don't want the soldiers here to see they got Peggy with them." I give her a drink of water and a chunk of dried meat, which she is happy to get. I want her to feel better, so I tells her me and the soldiers are going to save Peggy real soon. She says she and Peggy has decided that when they get free, they wants to go to Iowa, where some of their aunts and uncles and cousins live, near Keokuk on the Mississippi River. I asks her to tell me the names of the trappers. She says they called theirselves Raymond and Zeke. She said they'd tried digging gold in California but weren't able to find any, so now they was trapping again. Not much money in it, but it was all they knowed how to do. When I asks her how they hopes to get past Fort Laramie with nobody seeing them, she says they turned south a couple of miles back before I found her and was just making a big circle around the fort. That little Flaxie just held tight to my hand as we walked by a whole village of teepees that were set up on the meadow outside the fort walls. Some of them Injuns stared at us like they would want to come and get Flaxie if I weren't carrying my Hawken rifle primed and ready to fire. But pretty soon we is in the fort. We feel pretty safe now because there is lots of soldiers. Some of them is breaking horses in a corral. Others is marching. Lots is just standing around talking. I go up to the closest one and asks where I might find the commanding officer. He says Colonel Dent is in his office and points to a log cabin with an American flag on a tree in front of it. We hurries over there, and before we know it, Colonel Dent is making a fuss over Flaxie. He tells us how he learned all about her and Peggy from Tom Sawyer, and how Tom is out with a bunch of soldiers looking for the girls right now. Tom has told him about me too, and he is glad to meet me. He has a wife and 2 little girls of his own at the fort, and says Flaxie can stay with them until he figures out a way to get her back to Iowa. I tells him Peggy is no longer with the Injuns where Tom and the soldiers has gone looking, but she is with some trappers, circling south of the fort while we are talking. He don't seem to understand what I'm saying, because he says the soldiers with Tom are good trackers and will pick up the trail and save Peggy. When I try to explain that they're going in the wrong direction, he says he doesn't have enough men to send another patrol looking for Peggy. I tag along while he takes Flaxie over to his cabin so his wife and 2 girls can start making a fuss over her. When they says they is going to give her a bath and put her in a new dress, that's when I leave. Colonel Dent says I can have anything I want at the cookhouse, so I goes over to a long log building where they cooks the food for the soldiers and gets a tin plate heaped with buffalo stew. The cook soldier scoops it out of a big iron pot, which he says never gets empty. He just keeps adding new things as the soldier boys eat it down. Sometimes he throws in a couple of antelope or an elk, even prairie dogs, but mostly just buffalo and potatoes with lots of salt and pepper. I sits in the shade and eats like a boy who is half starved, and suppose I am but ain't thought much about it. I don't stop till I've cleaned up 3 plates, and am so full I don't think I can hardly stand up. Pretty soon I'm stretched out on the ground like a dead boy, sound asleep. When I wakes up, the fort is all in shadows because the sun is almost down. I looks across the parade grounds. Not many soldiers to see, so I guesses they is eating more of the wonderful buffalo stew. The big front doors to the fort is open, and pretty soon 2 Injuns rides in. One of them looks awful familiar. I am sure I have seen him before. Yes, it's Man Afraid of His Mother-in-Law. I am mighty sure because he is riding a mule that belonged to Mr. Mills. He and the other Injun with him tie their mules to the hitching post in front of the store the soldiers call the commissary and goes inside. They takes a bundle of stuff with them. Carefully I walks closer. I remember Mr. Mills saying this mule was his favorite. I even remember her name, Cleopatra. Then I recognizes the saddle. It belonged to Buck, Peggy's brother. I knows it's his because his name is carved on the skirt. I first think I better run and find Colonel Dent and ask him to arrest these Injuns, but I knowed from Tom how the Army did things. First they would put them in jail, then they would have to find some lawyers. Maybe they'd have to come from another fort. That would take time while Peggy was getting farther and farther away from here. Then the trial, and I'd be the main witness. The lawyers would want to know if I actually saw a Man Afraid of His Mother-in-Law kill somebody. It all happened so fast that all I really knowed was that Injuns was doing the killing and the Mills family was being killed, except for Peggy and Flaxie. And I knowed that Man Afraid was with them Injuns while it happened. Maybe I knew enough to get him hanged, and maybe I didn't. Meanwhile, Peggy might be in California before the trial was finished. I couldn't wait that long. I knowed if I was riding that mule, I could catch up with Peggy real fast, so I might as well just take it. If Man Afraid catches me taking it, the soldiers will save me, I thinks. If the soldiers catches me taking it, with Flaxie as my witness, I can prove I was just taking it back, and that it belonged to Flaxie's family. So I figures I have nothing to lose by taking it, so I just walks over to the mule, gets on, rests my rifle over the saddle horn, and rides out of the fort. I guess Man Afraid is going to be mighty mad, but I don't think there's nothing he can do. He won't go to the soldiers because he knows the mule and saddle is stole from white folks. He can't track me because the ground around the fort is splattered with millions of horses and mule tracks, so he won't know which ones to follow. As soon as I was around the corner of the fort, I head south at a fast trot. Sooner or later, I figure I'll cross the trail left by Peggy and the two trappers, then just follow until I catches up. Then I'll have to figure out a way to save Peggy so I can bring her back to the fort and join up with Flaxie. Maybe I will go with them back to Iowa. By now, I likes Peggy that much. I would go with her clear to New York if she would let me. Chapter 14. There's part of a moon, so I sees where I rides, but I fears it is so dark I might miss Peggy's trail, so I stops on a hilltop and waits for it to get light. The night is warm, so it's easy to sleep a little. I wrap the end of Cleopatra's lead rope around my wrist so she can graze but not pull away while I'm dozing. She is one of those rare mules that can be by herself or with a person and not go crazy wanting to get together with other mules and horses. So it was a peaceful night. At first light, I'm riding south again, higher and higher into the hills, looking for tracks and trails, and finally I finds the spur, going straight west on what looks like an old buffalo trail, mostly mule tracks in the bunch, and they looks new like they was just made. But the tracks aren't as fresh as I first thought, because after an hour or two I finds their camp where they spent the night. The ashes is cold, so I know they didn't build a morning fire. I guess they're hurrying to get around the fort before someone sees them. By late afternoon I rides to the top of a ridge so I can see a long way ahead. That's when I spot them. They are too far off to tell which one is Peggy, but I can make out 3 riders among a bunch of mules and horses, so I'm sure it's them. They seem to be moving pretty fast, but I reckon they will make camp soon, and when they do, I will have a chance to get close. My plan is simple. I will just crawl into their camp in the middle of the night, wake up Peggy, cut her free if she's tied up, then crawl back to Cleopatra. We'll ride double back to the fort, lickety-split, as fast as Cleopatra can go. Somehow plans I make never works out as they is supposed to. The riders was still traveling when it got too dark for me to see them. I knowed they was about to make camp because their mules were as tired and hungry as mine, but now it was too dark to see where they camped. So I gets off Cleopatra and just tries to follow their tracks real slow and careful. But pretty soon I can't see the tracks either, so I just listens and watches as I keep moving along. No moon, only some stars to light my way. I can tell by the outline of a nearby hill that I'm going in the right direction. I'm hoping they builds a nice fire to show me the way, or that some of their horses and mules wants to fight each other and makes lots of noise. But so far, I can see no fire and can't hear no mules. I moves real slow now, half a step at a time. Cleopatra is nice and quiet, following right behind me. Finally, I stops and listens, knowing they got to make some noise, sooner or later, even if they don't make no fire. I sits down and chews on a piece of dried meat while Cleopatra crops at some grass. The night is so quiet I hears her chewing. Pretty soon I rolls over on some grass and sleeps some. It's starting to get light when I finally hears something, a sharp pounding noise like a man beating a rock with a hammer. Then I know it's not a hammer that I hear, but a horse's foot, and it has a steel shoe on it. A horse's pawing, maybe the one they kept in camp while letting the others out to graze. I start sneaking closer. Then I hears a breaking limb, then another. They didn't make fire when they went to bed, but maybe they are making one now. The night is cool, and maybe they wants to cook some breakfast. I check my hawk and rifle. It's primed and ready to fire. When I know I'm awful close, I ties Cleopatra to a tree so she won't get in the way. The first thing I sees is their horses and mules, scattered across a hillside, filling up on the dew-damp grass. The pawing sound is closer. Then I sees the smoke. They is camped behind some rocks. I sneaks higher on the hill, trying to get a look at them. Then I sees Peggy. She still has that old elk skin covering her up. Her long hair hangs down over the back of the skin. Her hair looks dirty and like she ain't brushed it in a long time. I can't see her face. One of the trappers, a tall wire of a man with coal-black whiskers, is bent over some smoking sticks, blowing to get a fire a-going. The other trapper, a huge hog man, is sitting on a log slicing some meat into a pan. An old brown horse, the one they didn't let out to graze with the others, is still pawing at the rocks. Except for that, the camp is quiet. Nobody's talking. I'm close enough that I can shoot one of them real easy. Both of their rifles is resting against the log where the big man is sitting. I think of all the trouble it has been for me to find Peggy. I's followed her for many days in Injun country where I could get scalped. Now I's found her. The chase is over. Now I got to do something to save her. That's why I come this far. She don't wants to be with these trappers no more than she wanted to be with them Injuns. She wants to be with Flaxie, going home to Iowa. "Lift them hands over your heads," I says, stepping out from behind some rocks where I was hiding. Both men looks at me at the same time, and Peggy too, but nobody raises their hands, so I says, "Hands high or I start shooting." I cocks the hammer back because I forgot to do it earlier. Still nobody raises their hands. I starts to worry that something is wrong with me. They ain't scared. At least it don't seem that way. "Huck Finn, following me will get you killed," Peggy says, sounding more mad than glad I come to save her. "I'm done following," I says. "Now we're going back to the fort, and if one of your friends here don't like it, I can put a big hole in his—" "Land sakes," the hog man says, slowly putting the pan of meat on the ground. "We done saved this young lady and her little sister from the Injuns. You ought to be thanking us and giving us presents, not wanting to shoot us." "Won't be no shooting nobody if Peggy here comes back to the fort with me," I says, pointing my rifle directly at Hogman's face. "We'd have taken her there ourselves, but some of the soldier boys are a little mad about us taking their money in a poker game." "Give me Peggy and I won't tell the soldiers where they can find you," I says. "Now that's real nice," Hogface answers. Then he says to his friend, "Raymond, roll up her stuff in one of them buffalo robes so she can take it with her." Without getting to his feet, Wireman moves from the smoking sticks to a pile of robes and some other stuff. He's not very far from me. My rifle is still pointed at Hogface. Even with the trappers being so nice, my finger is on the trigger. "I don't have any stuff," Peggy says, but I just stands there, so nervous I can't think. Suddenly a buffalo skin has fallen over the barrel of my rifle. Wire slung it there. I try to point it at him as I pulls on the trigger, but I'm too late, and the bullet don't hit any flesh as both trappers pile on top of me. They wrestle away my hawking and buoy, and pretty soon they're holding my hands behind my back. When Peggy tries to grab one of their guns, Hog slaps her to the ground. I feels like I'm going to throw up, and don't know if it's from being so scared or from the stink Hog and Wire has rubbed off on me as they wrestled me. I guess neither one of them even knows what a bath is. They smell like smoke from burning hair, sweaty socks, and baby calf manure all mixed up. "Can I kill him?" Wire asks. "Later, after I find out what he knows," Hog replies. Then he asks me, "Who put you up to coming here?" I don't see any need to tell the truth because they is just going to kill me anyways, so I says I'm a special messenger for Colonel Dent at Fort Laramie, and he'll be coming along in short order. I don't think he believes me because he kicks me so hard in the side I thinks I'm going to break in half. Finally, I throws up all over the buffalo skin that Wire throwed over my rifle. Hog kicks me again in the other side. I can't throw up no more. I feels like I'm going to die without them even having to kill me. "Who knows you followed us?" he asks. I knows he's just going to kick me again if I lie, and my mind is so mixed up from the pain in my sides I just tells the truth. "I would have told Tom Sawyer I was going to follow you," I explains. "But Tom was going east with the soldiers because he think Peggy was still with the Injuns. Only Jim and me knowed you took her, and Jim is still with the Injuns, still cleaning hides as far as I know." He seemed pleased with my explanation, but then I got to thinking that he and Wire would be more likely to kill me if they thought nobody was looking for me. So I says, "But as soon as Tom and the soldiers find the Injuns, Jim will tell them which ways me and Peggy went, and they'll come a-running. Them soldiers feed their ponies grain, you know, so they can travel faster than normal folks. I figure they might be here by nightfall. I leave them a clear trail. I had a can of red paint from the fort which I poured on rocks and bushes every mile or so." I figured details like this would make my story sound truer. Tom learned me that. He was the best liar of any boy I ever knowed, and I weren't too bad at it myself. "If the soldiers finds me and Peggy alive, they won't have no need to keep chasing, but if we's dead, they'll follow you fellers clean to the Pacific Ocean." "Nobody said nothing about killing Peg girl," Hog growled. "She's our squaw now," Wire added. "Shut up," Hog yelled. "Let's just kill him," Wire whined. "Hold up your hands so I can see them," Hog says to me. I obeys. "No red on his hands," Hog says, more to himself than to Wire. A boy pouring red paint on rocks and bushes to get some on his hands. He's lying. Then he says to Wire, cut off his scalp and skin his face. They'll think Injuns done it, and they won't know who he is if they finds him. Wire grabs my hair and picks my buoy off the ground. He don't need to be asked twice to hurt me. His face is happy like a boy who just got an ice cream cone on the 4th of July. He has that old knife against my forehead and is about to start cutting when Peggy says, Wait, listen to me. I promise to be your squaw for the winter and not to run away if you let Flaxie go. I will promise more if you don't hurt Huck. I'll be your squaw for 2 winters, not just 1, she says. If we don't kill him? Hogg asks. Swear on the Bible, cross my heart, hope to die, she says, looking happy like we was playing nigger in the woodpile. I don't know what to think. This Peggy, the brightest, cleanest, best girl I ever knowed, is giving herself to pigs to save me. It ain't right, so I says, don't promise nothing, Peggy. Don't promise anything, she says, like she is more interested in correcting my speech than saving her life. Then to Hogg, she says, you better accept before I change my mind. All right, he says, we won't hurt the boy. You said I can take his scalp and skin his face, Wire whined. No scalping and skinning today, Hogg says. If we let him go, he'll run to the fort and get the soldiers, Wire protested. You weren't so dumb after all, because that's exactly what I was going to do. Depends on how we let him go, Hogg sneered. You promised not to hurt him, Peggy reminded them. Pointing his rifle at my face, Hogg orders me to take my boots off. When I does it, he kicks them over by Peggy. Then he tells me to take off my pants and shirt. When I hesitates, he cocks back the hammer on his rifle, and Wire reaches towards my throat with the point of the buoy. You promised not to hurt him, Peggy warns. He won't get hurt if he does what we tells him, Hogg says. Reluctantly, I obeys. The embarrassment of undressing in front of Peggy is almost worse than the fear of the 2 men hurting me. I can't look at her, although I feel her looking at me. Hogg throws my clothes towards Peggy and orders her to put them on, the boots too. She don't hesitate. When she flips off the elk skin, I'm so embarrassed to see the whiteness of her skin that I think I should look away. But I don't. Then I realize it's not her skin I see, but the white pantaloons and nightshirt. They are not as white as when she and Flaxie were washing with the squaws in the crick. I guess Hogg and Wire had wrestled her around in the dirt and got them dirty. I wanted to kill them real bad, but I was glad Peggy was getting some decent clothes, even if they was mine. I didn't understand my feelings when she throwed off the elk hide and started slipping into my trousers and shirt. I just tingled all over, up and down my arms and legs and right to the middle between my back and chest. Her clothes was dirty, and she had been riding a dusty trail for days without a bath, but she was the most beautiful human being I ever seen. And I think if it were possible to worship a human being, I had found the perfect one. Why she have to wear the boys' clothes? Wire asked. We'll cut her hair, too, so folks will think a boy's traveling with us, Hogg says. They won't be near so curious and won't think nothing of it. Now listen real careful and you won't die, Hogg says. If you do your walking when the sun is up, it'll burn you until you die. If you try to walk at night when you can't see where you steps, your feet'll fill up with cactus needles until you can't walk no more and you'll die. You got about an hour at sunup and another hour at dusk when you can walk. Ought to reach the fort in 4 or 5 days. By then we'll be so far away the soldiers will never find us. Do as I say and you can live. What them trappers didn't know was that I had a mule tied up in the bushes not very far away. Riding the mule, I could reach the fort sometime during the coming night. Colonel Dent would send soldiers with me this time, I was sure. I was sitting on a rock, my bare knees tucked up under my chin when they said goodbye. They were all on their horses now, and their mules were packed too. Travel at dawn and dusk like he says, Peggy warned as she rode up close. I don't want you to die, Huck, not for me. It isn't worth it. Not any more. I'll get them soldiers, I whisper. I have a mule to take me to the fort. We'll save you, and it won't be very long. Slow them down if you can. I wink at her, but she don't wink back. The soldiers, not them soldiers, she says, correcting my speech again. I don't understand it. She never corrected my speech before her folks was killed. Now it's all she does when I'm around. It don't make sense. Huck Finn, don't follow me any more, she says, her voice now loud enough for the trappers to hear. Get to the fort and make sure Flaxie is on the next wagon to Iowa. Then forget about me. In time I'll come home, but I won't have you getting killed trying to hurry things up." I guess she is a really fine actor, and that she is saying all that for the trappers to hear so they don't think I'm going to fetch the soldiers. Then she says, "My family and Brace are dead. I don't want anybody else to die, not on my account. What I was saving for my husband is gone, and it is never coming back. I will find my way back to Iowa to see Flaxie. Don't follow me any more, please." I don't say a thing. Her acting is so good I'm beginning to think she really means for me to stay away. But with them two trappers in earshot, I can't ask her to make things clear for me. So I just keep my mouth shut, and my nakedness covered up as much as I can with my arms and legs, looking at Peggy, feeling like an orphan calf looking at a bottle of warm milk. I'd never felt this way about anybody ever before, not even Becky Thatcher, and don't know what to make of it. I'd never been one to risk his skin for anybody, but I am now, for Peggy. Finally, they rides away, and I darts into the bushes, running as fast as I can towards my mule, thinking all the while how dumb they is not to think I might have something to ride to the fort. I figure I can be at the fort sometime in the night, and come back at dawn with a bunch of soldier boys to save Peggy. When I reaches the last ridge above the place where I tied the mule, I just jumps off the top of the ridge and runs as fast as I can down to her. She is still there, but I guess I surprised her some, maybe a lot, and I guess she never seen a naked boy running at her before. Her eyes gets real big and she snorts all the wet stuff out of her nose. Then she decides to go back to the fort without me. I had tied her real good to them bushes, but they ain't big trees, and nothing can pull harder than a scared mule. She pulls them bushes right out of the ground and takes off running as fast as she can go towards the fort, leaving me standing there wearing nothing but the skin I was born in. I knowed now I should have stopped at the top of the hill, talked gently to get her attention so there warn't no surprise, then walked up to her nice and slow, giving her plenty of time to see and smell and get used to my naked body, knowing she had never seen nothing like that before. But I can't do it over. She is gone. I made a horrific mistake, and now I will pay for being so dumb. Maybe I will die. Chapter 15. So I just walk along, following that crazy mule. I reckon if I don't run after her that she might stop after a while, remember who I was, and let me catch up to her. The sun is bright and up high in the sky, so I can't use it to decide which way to go. But Cleopatra knows the way back, even though she's only been there once, so all I has to do is follow her until I catches her, or until I reaches the fort, whichever happens first. Those trappers said the sun would burn me up, but it don't feel very hot, and my skin don't feel burned, even with my shoulders and back as white as a slab of hog fat. Most summers I was nice and brown from swimming in the river, but this year, out in the wilderness with so many mean Injuns, we just never had time for swimming and playing and lazying in the sun. This was the first time I warn't wearing a shirt. And this was the first time I went walking without no boots, so my feet weren't as tough as they usually was. I hadn't gone very far when I had to stop and pull out some cactus spines. There were cuts, too, from sharp sticks and rocks. I could see those trappers was right about me not being able to travel in the dark with bare feet. If I couldn't see where I was stepping, my feet would get slaughtered so bad I wouldn't be able to walk at all. I went slower, trying to be more careful. The longer I hiked, the warmer the sun felt. Without no clothes, I felt like a strip of buffalo meat, like the Injun squaws hanged on them willow racks in the sun. It'd take about a day, maybe two, for a piece of meat like that to get all dried out. I knowed the same thing would happen to me if I didn't find something to drink. I also knowed that if I dried out, I would lose my strength. If I wanted to keep walking, I had to drink. When I starts walking after the mule, my only thought is to get to the fort as fast as I can. But after a couple of hours of walking in the sun, my shoulders are as pink as the skin on the belly of a white pig, and I'm so thirsty I knows I might die if I ain't careful enough. Still, with each tender step, I think about Peggy having to ride away with them two filthy men who bought her from the Injuns like she was a goat or a sack of beans. From what she said, I knowed she had been violated, like Tom said. She told me she warn't worth saving no more, but I knowed she was. She was still the same bright, wonderful, beautiful Peggy. I knowed it because I had seen her with my own eyes. She talked different now, but after all that happened, I could understand why she might change some. When the sun gets low in the sky, I find a long, narrow valley with a little creek running down the middle, some grass on both sides. I hurries down there, feeling the wet green grass soft under my feet. Then I drops on my belly and swallers cool water until my insides hurt worse than my feet and back. Then I rolls over on my back and closes my eyes. But I ain't able to sleep or nothing because my back is burned by the sun and is as tender as my feet now. Besides that, the wet grass is full of gnats and mosquitoes who are starting to look for something to eat now the sun is getting low in the sky. And my naked body must look like a Roman feast. Pretty soon I'm rolling around in the grass trying to squash the ones that lands in places I can't reach. Pretty soon I make a swatter from some green willows close to the water so I can swoosh them away as I walks along the edge of the water, hoping I might see a fish I can catch with my hands. Every once in a while I drop to my belly and drink more water. I wishes so bad I had a can or a skin so I could carry water with me, but I don't. So all I can do is keep filling my belly until I can't hold another drop. The mule tracks had come down to the creek too. I can see where she got herself a drink and munched some of the tender grass. But since the little creek don't lead to the fort, she soon wandered back up on the prairie to find the trail to the fort. Just before dark I leaves the creek too, hoping the gnats and mosquitoes will stay behind. After a while, just a few of them were trying to eat me, and soon I scared all of them away with my swatter. When it was too dark to see where I was putting my feet, I went to the middle of a tall stand of buffalo grass where I rolled up in a ball, on my side, my knees almost touching my chest, and tried to go to sleep. I warn't thirsty no more, but my stomach growled with hunger. I chewed on some grass, but it didn't take the hunger away. If only I was a cow or buffalo, then I could fill right up. First I would lay on one side, then the other. Sometimes I would sleep a bit, but it ain't easy to sleep when you are outside and naked, even in the summer when it's warm. When I did doze off, I dreamed about Peggy, sitting so pretty by the stream with Flaxie and the squaws. Or I would see Blue Fox and Hogface killing Mr. and Mrs. Mills or Brace Johnson. Sometimes I see Blue Fox or the trappers coming to Peggy in the night, but I always wake up before they do anything. As soon as the sky turned gray and the stars started to go away, I started walking again. Not only was I looking for soft places to put my feet, but I was looking for things to eat. I remembered how Tom and I had killed and eaten the rattlesnakes after Peggy had been carried off by the Injuns. But we had had lucifer sticks so we could build a fire. If I found a snake now, I would have to eat it without cooking. I wondered if I would be able to do that. By the time the sun was high in the sky, I knew I would. I also knew I had to find some shade so I could keep my burning back out of the sun. Just when I had about decided I would have to shade myself with tall grass, I found another one of them little creeks winding down a narrow valley, and the mule's tracks led right down there, but she wasn't there now. Before running to the water, I picked an armload of the tall grass to carry with me. It seemed like a paradise, except there were not coconut trees. There was brush to shade me from the sun, enough cool water to satisfy the thirst of 1,000 buffaloes, and lots of green and black frogs that jumped in the water as I walked along the edge of the creek. I was surprised there weren't so many gnats and mosquitoes, maybe because the sun was high enough to make them hide, or maybe because there was an army of frogs to eat them up. After filling my belly with the cool water, I crawled along the edge of the creek until I catched me a big fat frog. His back was green and had big black spots, but his belly was white like the ones on catfishes. I wished I had my buoy to slice him up, but I didn't. He kept trying to wiggle out of my hand, so I slapped the back of his head against a flat rock until he held still enough for me to chop him in half with the sharp edge of a long rock, right where the belly joined the tops of his legs. I throwed away the part with the head and belly, then carefully pulled the skin off the legs. It warn't too hard, just like pulling wet pants off a dead man, I reckon. There weren't very much meat on the legs, but it was firm and light pink in color like rattlesnake, with blue blood vessels running up and down. I bit off the biggest pieces, chewed and swallowed. If I lived through this and anybody asked how raw frog tasted, I would say it was like chicken that hadn't been left in the pan long enough. There was only a couple of small bites for me to get off that frog's legs, but I swear I could feel the strength from those frog muscles oozing into my muscles. Now I had more energy to do stuff. I catched me more frogs, figuring out a better way to do it. Instead of crawling through the grass trying to grab them with my hands, I fetched a stick about as long as my leg and just swatted them like flies. It didn't matter if they was in the water or in the grass. They weren't fast enough to dodge the stick. Pretty soon I had 32 frogs spread out in the grass. I cut them in half like I did the first one, then pulled off all their pants. After eating half of them, I spread the rest out in the sun to dry so I could take them with me when I went back up on the prairie. I didn't think I'd find any more places like this before I reached the fort, so I wanted to carry some food with me. I took a good nap, then began to play with the tall grass that I had brung with me. First I braided and tied a mess of it into a cape to cover my shoulders. There was a hole in the middle that I slipped my head through. Then I tied up a belt to go around my waist with a clump of braided grass in front and another in back. Now I wouldn't have to enter the fort totally naked, and I wouldn't be so embarrassed if I ran into some folks on the trail. Then I tried to braid up some grass into shoes. It weren't too hard, but when I tried to put them on and walk around, it didn't take very many steps before they come apart. I tried and tried, but just couldn't make a good slipper. Finally, I gave up. I takes another nap, and when I wakes up, I felt even better. But the wind was blowing now, and big black clouds was coming down from the north. That is, at first I thought they was clouds, but pretty soon I could smell them. They weren't regular clouds, but smoke clouds was coming from the north on the wind. I runs out of my little valley to the prairie and looks north. I can't see nothing burning, but the smoke looks awful thick off in the distance. I never seen so much smoke in all my years on the river. All I can figure is that the prairie is on fire, but I can't see no flames. Now, the grass up on the prairie is still mostly green like in the spring, but it's a lot drier than just a few weeks ago because there ain't been no rain in a long time, but lots of wind to dry it out. With my grass cap and cape and loincloth, I'm ready to march to the fort, but now I ain't sure. That prairie grass is thick and tall, and a fire driven by the wind might probably cook a body, especially one wearing grass clothes. I looked down where I'd been taking a nap, where the frogs lived. There was lots of water there, and clover and green soggy grass, not the kind of place that could burn. I wanted to get to the fort awful bad to fetch the soldiers to save Peggy, but I had this sick feeling that if I got catched by the fire, I might not get to the fort ever. I decided to stay close to the frogs until the fire passed or went out or whatever fires do out in the Injun territories. I'm curious to see what this fire looks like, so I stay up on the prairie and walk towards the smoke, staying close to the edge of the little valley so I can get down there fast when I see the flames. Then I think about the buffaloes and how I'd heard stories how they stampeded in front of fires. I ain't seen very many, but there was sign everywhere. Places where the grass had been cropped off, trails in and out of the valleys where the frogs lived, big dusty wallows where the bulls rolled and fought each other, lots of buffalo chips, mostly dry ones. Tom said there was millions of buffaloes in this country along the Platte River. I just hoped they weren't in front of the fire, stampeding in my direction, because there weren't no trees in this entire land big enough to climb so a body could get away from stampeding buffaloes. Tom said you could hear the ground shaking before you could see 'em, so I laid down and put my ear on the ground. I couldn't hear nothing and I couldn't feel nothing, so I guessed if the buffaloes was stampeding, they weren't doing it anywhere close to me, so I kept walking and the smoke got thicker and thicker. I warn't following the mule tracks no more, but I knowed I warn't lost. The frog creek below me was a little bigger now, and I figured it had to be flowing somewheres, probably to the Platte River, since it was running north. I knew that because the setting sun was on my left side. Because of the smoke, I weren't able to see it clear, but I knowed it was there. If I just followed the little creek north, I would get to the river. Then all I had to do was follow it downstream until I got to Fort Laramie. When it was almost too dark to see, I headed down to the water to find a comfortable place to spend the night. I was happy to find that the gnats and mosquitoes were so busy choking on smoke that they didn't want to bother me no more. It was going to be a pleasant night, even though I knowed I wouldn't sleep much because I knowed that sooner or later the fire would come, unless the wind changed or a big rainstorm put it out, but there was so much smoke that I couldn't tell if there were clouds in the sky. I chews me up a jaw full of frog meat and tries to get some sleep. I'd been dozing a long while, it seemed, when I opens my eyes and sees that the north part of the sky had turned mostly orange. The smoke was thicker than before, making my throat and nose sore, and it was still coming from the north. The fire had finally found me. I hiked to the top of the ridge to get a better look. In the distance I could see the flames like the tongues of 1,000 monster dragons racing towards me, licking up every dry thing in their path. It was hard to tell how big the flames were, but I guessed some of them were as high as a man's head, if he were sitting on a tall horse. I knew I couldn't outrun the fire, not in bare feet, and I thought that if I tried to run through it to get on the other side so it would be burning away from me, I would probably burn the skin off my feet and maybe just burn up altogether. So I runs back down to the little crick. The light from the fire made it easy to see where I was going and what I was doing. I finds a wide spot on the crick where it is about a foot deep. There I sit and wait. I don't reckon the fire will burn the soggy grass and clover next to the crick, and I knows if I gets too hot, all I has to do is roll into the crick and just stick my nose out every once in a while when I need air. It is a simple enough plan, and it works just fine. When the fire is burning on both banks, right down to the edge of the soggy grass, I crawl into the cool water and lay right down in it like a hog in a waller on a July afternoon. Grass burns fast, and the big prairie fire came and went almost before I could make sense of it. And then fresh air was blowing in behind it, not nearly as smoky as before. I found me a soft place on the grass and tried to get some more sleep. When morning came, the fire and smoke had disappeared somewhere far to the south. There was little fountains of smoke here and there where thicker bushes and sticks had catched on fire, and was still burning, but the main fire had left. The rolling hills was black and scorched in every direction as far as I could see. The land looked dead and black and awful scary. I decided to stay by my little frog crick as I started north again. Pretty soon I'm distracted from my march because I'm seeing so many frogs jumping into the water as I walk by. I fetched me another stick and started busting them. Almost before I knows it, I's catched 40 more. When I don't reckon I can carry any more, I see a little bush by the edge of the hill that is still smoking. I goes over there and starts breaking off smoking twigs and branches, crowding them into a pile and huffing and puffing until they starts burning. Now I have me a cook fire, and I knows exactly what I wants to do with it. In a few minutes I'm roasting frog legs on a stick. Now I have eaten raw legs and cooked ones too. The cooked ones is better. I catches, cleans, and cooks frogs until I'm too tired to keep doing it. My belly is too full. I'm a new boy ready to travel. The wet, soggy grass next to the crick is the softest on my feet, so that's where I tries to walk. Sometime in the afternoon I climbs to the top of the east bank to look over the prairie again, and I see something there that I hain't seen before, a bunch of big burned bumps out on the ground where the grass is burned away. At first I reckon they is black rocks, but as I gets closer they looks more like a herd of sleeping buffaloes. Not a lot, maybe 10 or 15. I can see some horns and what looks like feet sticked up in the air. As I walk closer I can see for sure that they are buffaloes, but they ain't sleeping because they is dead. At first I reckon they has been caught and killed by the fire, but as I walk among them it seems the skins on their backs has been burned right off. But there is still skin on their legs and faces. Then I sees a broken arrow shaft in one of them. Now I reckon them buffaloes had been killed by Injuns who had skinned some of them and taken meat from some, but left before getting all of it. Maybe the fire had chased them off. I look past the buffaloes in every direction, but can't see no Injuns or nothing that looks like an Injun camp. If only I had my bowie, I thinks I could cut off some of that skin and make me some shoes. I could cut out a stomach and make a canteen to carry my water. If only I had a knife. Then I gets an idea. I hurries over to the one that has the broken arrow shaft in his side, and I pulls it out. Bless my good luck. The tip on the arrow ain't made from stone, but good old American iron. Some Injun with a cold chisel had stamped it out of an old barrel hoop, then filed the edges until they were sharp enough to shave a man's face. I don't travel no more that day. By nightfall I have 2 new shoes made from sleeves of shank skin from the hind legs of an old bull, turned inside out so the hair is on the inside. I ties up the fronts and backs with strips of skin. Now I can hike like a soldier, thinking that tough old bull skin hadn't ought to wear out any time soon. I make me a hide cape to protect my shoulders from the sun and to help cover me at night. A new skin belt around my waist holds up a piece of soft hide in front and behind. So if Peggy rides up now, I have no reason at all to be embarrassed. I have a loop of skin attached to both ends of a stomach so I can carry near a gallon of water with me. Now I don't have to stay by the crick if I don't wants to. But best of all, I finds another smoking bush, breaks up the branches, and soon have another fire making a happy, crackly noise as I cooks a big chunk of buffalo hump meat, which Brace Johnson told me was the very best thing a man could hope to eat out on the plains. Earlier in the day, I was thinking that roasted frog legs was probably the best thing a man could ever hope to eat. But after 2 swallows of hump roast, I didn't care if I never seed another frog as long as I lived. Brace was right. Take me to the Queen's Palace and set me on a golden chair at the grand buffet, and I can't think of anything I'd rather eat than a buffalo hump roast, medium rare. Only a little salt could make it better. When I'm full, I lay strips of meat on sticks around the fire like I seen the squaws and Peggy do. Now I would have dried meat as well as water to take with me. I'd saved myself. I was going to live, unless some mean Injuns found me. It was time to start thinking about saving Peggy again. I reckon the fire didn't catch her because those trappers would be traveling fast, wanting to get far away from them soldiers at Fort Laramie, in case I got there and told them where Peggy is gone. I was marching a course that I reckon would get me to Fort Laramie the fastest. My canteen was full, strips of drying meat was hanging from my belt, and my new buffalo shoes was strapped on tight. I was thinking again of Peggy and what might happen between us once I got her saved. I starts wondering how old I am. My pappy never told me. Was I a young boy who had no business thinking of a girl like Peggy, or was I almost as old as she was, and maybe somebody she might fall in love with? I just didn't know. I wished pappy had told me when I was born. It warn't long until my new shoes and my legs below the knees was as black as if they had been smeared with axle grease. The ashes from the fire just made everything that touched it black. I was glad I had lots of water because the day seemed to be hotter than most. Maybe it had something to do with the sun burning down on the black earth. Everything was black and parched. No cool green meadows no more. Then I starts feeling dizzy, tripping and stumbling a little bit. My head feels like it's on fire and my stomach is gurgling. I throw up once, twice, 3 times. I has to stop and rest more than is usual for a strong boy like me. I keep taking sips of the water in the stomach, but I can't swallow the meat no more. After a while, I ain't sure if I'm going in the right direction. The sun is in the middle of the sky, so I can't tell which way is north, but I just keep walking, sort of stumbling along. I reckon a smart man would stop until the sun was low enough in the sky to tell him which way to go. But I warn't smart no more. My head hurt so bad. My stomach sure had something rotten in it. My legs were shaking. I started falling down until I was black all over. If someone found me now, they might think I was a runaway slave. Still, I kept stumbling along. Nothing made sense, not no more. Then I passed out. Chapter 16. He ain't no Injun, and he ain't no slave. His name is Huckleberry Finn. I knows him, were the words that wakes me up. The voice is familiar. It belongs to Tom Sawyer. I opens my eyes. It's Tom's face looking down at me. Other faces, too. I ain't dead. I knows it because my head still hurts, something fierce, and my stomach is still gurgling like a hungry alligator, but I ain't hungry. "He don't look like no white boy," says a man's voice. I rolls over and starts throwing up again, but my stomach is empty, so nothing comes out. "He's sick. We gotta doctor him," Tom says. "We ain't stopping for no sick boy," the man's voice says. "Gots keep moving till we get out of the burn, no grass for the mules." "Can't just leave him here," Tom says, and I thinks amen to that. "Chuck him in the possum belly," the man says. "When we gets to grass, we can doctor him, maybe clean him up some. Gots to keep moving." "Yaw!" he yells, and I can hear the creaking of a wagon starting to move. Next I feels hands grabbing my hands and feet, but my eyes is bleary and I can't see the faces. I hear swearing and grunting as the hands roll me into the possum belly under a wagon that ain't started moving yet. Soon's I'm in there, I feels the wagon move. Folks who ain't been outside the nice towns of the United States might not know what a possum belly is. When pioneers and freighters travel long distances, sometimes they takes an old hide, punches holes in the 4 corners so's they can tie it under a wagon. As the folks travels along and they find some beautiful pine knots for the night fire or shoots a varmint that needs skinning later on, or just want to pick up buffalo chips to burn, They throws all this stuff into the possum belly because they don't want to get the important truck up in the wagon all dirty. People don't generally ride in the possum belly, even though it might be the shadiest and coolest place around, because it is also the dustiest, dirtiest place in the world. And sometimes the bottom of it bumps against rocks and stumps that come along in the middle of the road. They throwed me in the possum belly, but I didn't much care, being so sick and all. I was just happy I warn't in the sun no more. I was so sick I didn't seem to breathe much anyway, so the dust didn't do no harm. I kept thinking I don't want to die because then I wouldn't be around to save Peggy. So I try as hard as a body can to stay alive as the wagon bounces along. Sometimes Tom crawls alongside real fast, asking if I am still alive. I just grunts to let him know I am, even if just a little bit. Between those times, I didn't know if I'm sleeping or knocked out. Anything is better than being awake, feeling sick, swallowing dust and ashes, and bumping against heaps of dirt and rock in the road. Then I wakes up and hears men and boys yelling. The wagon is moving fast now, bouncing me up against the bottom of the wagon as the possum belly springs up and down. If this goes on very long, I guess I will sure die. Finally, when the wagon slows down, I feels and hears a soft, gentle scratching under the possum belly. We are in grass now, long, tall grass. I smells it. No more ashes. We have left the burned prairie. We stops, and the next thing I knows is Tom pulling me out of the possum belly. I hopes I never has to go in there again. I'm full of thankfulness to know I am still alive. My head don't hurt so bad, neither does my stomach. I'm not hungry, but I feel like I can swallow a river, that if I don't get a drink of water, a big drink of water soon, I will die anyways. I see Tom is reading my thoughts. He's standing beside me, a bucket of river water in his hand. He's asking some other boys if they knows where a cup is. "Gimme the bucket," I says. I'm sitting with my back against a wagon wheel, so Tom, he just sets the whole bucket in my lap and goes away. Someone is yelling at him to help unhitch some mules. The bucket is nearly full, and some of the water slops over the edge, the coolness spreading over my belly and tops of my legs. It feels good, like rolling off a log into the Mississippi River on a scalding hot day. After a while, I tries to lift the rim of the bucket to my lips, but it is too heavy, like a giant rock. I reckon it ain't really that heavy. I can't lift it because my arms are so weak. So I starts rocking the bucket back and forth, sloshing more cool, delicious water onto my chest. Finally, I spills enough where I am able to lift the edge of the bucket to my lips, where I drinks 100 tiny swallows until I can't get any more inside me. Then I just closes my eyes and rests, waiting for the water to make me stronger. When Tom finishes his chores, he comes and sits by me, and we talk. We can see some boys and a big man with a black beard by one of the other wagons. They have themselves a big fire and are cooking up some supper. Tom says the man is Mr. Peabody, a sergeant in the United States Army. The Army is going out west to put down a Mormon rebellion and put a real governor over the Utah Territory. The Mormons is marrying all the wives they can catch, and Sergeant Peabody says they kills anybody who disagrees with them, Tom explained. I asked Tom why he had joined up with the Army. With the new war out west, the Army don't have enough men to do the freighting, he explained. Sergeant Peabody has to haul supplies for the rest of the Army, especially grain for the mules. Not enough soldiers to do the work, so he hires boys and slaves. But he says he will die before he hires an Injun or Chinaman. He pays me 50 cents a day, same as the other boys, and feeds us. "Why you going further from the United States?" I asks. "Didn't reckon you wanted to see more Injuns." "No, I don't, not so long as I lives, unless it's a hanging with Blue Fox as the guest of honor," Tom says. "But I figures I can't pass up a chance to see a real war. People say the big wars of the world are over, so this might be the only chance a boy like me will ever have to see a real war, even if it is only a little one against the Mormons. Peabody says when they catches Brigham Young, Lot Smith, and Dan Wells, he is personally a-going to skin them with the rusty butcher knife. I just hope I gets to see it. Sergeant Peabody says some of the Mormon men grows horns on their heads. If I can get me a set of them, I'd hang 'em in my cabin some day, and be so proud to have 'em when the Mormons is gone and everybody else wishes they had a set of horns too, but there are no more to be got." "Maybe the Mormons won't fight," I says. "Maybe they will run to California or Mexico." "They already started fighting," he says. "You mean fighting and killing and stuff like that," I says. "Not yet, but they are setting the prairie on fire so the army mules won't have nothing to eat," he says. "They done burned some army wagons and stole some others." After a while, Tom helps me to my feet and holds on tight as we ambles over to the fire. There's 5 wagons in a circle. Nice big mules are wandering around filling their mouths with grass like they hadn't had anything in a week. After we sits down, Tom tells the other boys my name, but Sergeant Peabody don't seem interested. He never looks up from where he's chewing a big wad of tobacco while stirring a pot of boiling buffalo meat with beans and onions. It smells good, and I hopes maybe I can have some. Tom tells me if I hurry and get strong, he thinks Sergeant Peabody will hire me too at 50 cents a day. Then I can watch the war between the Mormons and the Army, too. I'm surprised that all Tom wants to talk about is the war with the Mormons. I never knowed any Mormons, and neither did he. He don't seem at all curious to know what happened to Peggy and Flaxie, so I says nothing. Pretty soon Mr. Peabody starts scooping the food onto tin plates that had U.S. Army stamped on them. He looks like he's too fat to fit into his blue and yellow uniform. Some of the buttons is popped off his shirt where it can't fit round his belly. His uniform is dirty from all the ashes, and the parts that ain't stretched tight against his skin are wrinkled. He has a thick, curly black beard that covers his collar, and his coal lump eyes is too close together. He chews tobacco while he works, once in a while spitting a brown river of juice on the ground. His crooked teeth are yellow-brown from the chewing. The parts of his beard near his mouth are more brown than black. After Sergeant Peabody fixes a tin plate for all of the other boys, he finally squints at me, a look on his face like he is trying to decide to bury me or feed me, and like he's still not sure that I'm a white boy and not an Injun. Finally, he puts some food on a plate which he hands to Tom so he can give it to me. "Thank you," I says to Sergeant Peabody when Tom hands me the plate. After all the water, I feel stronger now, and pretty soon I'm swallowing the food, and it tastes real good. And I can feel my arms and legs getting stronger with each bite. Some of the boys try talking to me, asking me to tell them what it's like to live like an Injun. "Not bad," I says, "if you can eat frogs." I knowed from the looks on their faces that none of them had ever had any frogs before. After supper, Tom takes me down to the river and helps me slip out of my buffalo skin cape and loincloth. He orders me to get in the water and scrub off the ashes while he goes back to the wagons to find some real clothes. In a little while I am dressed in cotton pants, a wool shirt, and a good pair of cowhide boots, and my wet hair is combed with a nice part in the middle. When we walks back to the wagons, Sergeant Peabody comes over and shakes my hand like he ain't seen me before, like I ain't the same boy they had tossed into the possum belly. After spitting out a puddle of brown juice by my feet, he says in a couple of days, when I don't need to ride anymore, he will give me some chores to do and start paying me like the other boys. Of course, the cost of my new clothes will come out of my pay. That night, as we lay stretched out on wool blankets looking up at the prairie sky, I tells Tom about Peggy and Flaxie, how the trappers bought them from Blue Fox. Tom gets real fidgety when I tells him how Peggy promised the trappers she would stay with them for a season if they would let Flaxie go to Fort Laramie, and then how she promised to stay a second season if they let me go after they catched me. "Brace was right," Tom says. "She is crazy, being catched and violated up like that. She should have stabbed herself when she had the chance. Now she ain't worth saving." I told him she didn't seem crazy to me the last time I seen her, when she talked the trappers into letting me go. I said the honest truth was that I thought she was more worth saving than ever, after what she had done for Flaxie and me. "When we gets to Fort Bridger, I aim to find her and set her free," I says. "She's been defiled," Tom says, like he is the wisest boy in the whole world, like what he says makes what I say about Peggy not worth the air it takes to say it. I wants to beat him up, but knows I ain't strong enough to do it. "At least I saved Jim," Tom says. He tells that when he went back to Blue Fox's camp with the soldiers, the girls was gone, but Tom argued until the soldiers agreed to free Jim from Injun slavery and take him back to Fort Laramie. "Old Jim, he was crazy like Peggy," Tom says. "How do you mean?" I asks. "He didn't want no soldiers setting him free. Them black-skinned folks talks all the time about being free, but when the chance finally comes, they don't want it. Old Jim, he didn't want to come back to Fort Laramie with us. He said he'd just like to stay there and scrape hides if that was all right by us, but it warn't." I remembered the last time I seen Jim, that night at Blue Fox's camp. and how that squaw had set herself down beside Jim and leaned her head on his big arm, and how Jim seemed so happy about it, like he just wanted to die for that squaw. He didn't much want to come away with me any more than with the soldiers. "So what'd you do?" I asks. "The lieutenant ordered him to come with us," Tom explains, "but he don't want to do it, so the soldiers wrestled him to the ground, tied up his hands and feet, and throwed him over a mule. He wiggled and yelled halfway back to Laramie. Plumb crazy. I wonder what it is living with Injuns that makes folks go crazy, good folks like Peggy and Jim." I didn't even try to answer his question because I didn't think Peggy was crazy, Jim either. So I asks, "Where is he now?" "With the soldiers that's catching up with us. He don't like it, but they made him make an X on a piece of paper so they could make him a cook in the United States Army. You'll get to see him in a day or two." About this time, I hear one of the other boys crying under one of the wagons where he was supposed to be sleeping. I asks Tom what might be happening. Tom says, "About every night the sergeant makes one of the boys sleep with him. He must hit them in his sleep or roll on them by accident, because all of them start crying one time or another like this one. The sergeant can't get me to sleep with him. I just won't do it." "Me neither," I says. We had to stop talking because it was Tom's turn to take the watch. All night the older boys took turns watching for Injuns who might want to steal our mules, or Mormons who might want to burn our wagons. The next morning I asks Tom if he seen anything while standing watch. "Just a bunch of stars," he says. When I asks him if it was hard to stay awake, he said it warn't because he knowed what happened to boys who slept on watch. Sergeant Peabody tied them to wagon wheels, taked their shirts off, and cut lines on their backs with his bullwhip. Tom didn't want no part of that. He said he stayed awake by walking around all the time, never sitting or lying down, because that's when old Mr. Sleep catched a body. When I asked him if he had ever seen Mr. Peabody whip a boy for sleeping, he said he had lots of times. I thought he might be stretching the truth some, but I said nothing. The next day, Sergeant Peabody put me to work oiling harnesses. The day after that, he had me feeding grain to the mules and oiling harnesses. By the fourth day, I was harnessing and unharnessing the mules, giving them grain and oiling harnesses. He told us boys to enjoy our vacation because one day soon the United States Cavalry would catch up with us, and then we'd have 100 more horses and mules to take care of. Sometimes after supper, old Peabody would put away his plug of tobacco, get out a bottle, and start to drinking. After that, it warn't long until he started cussing the things he didn't like. He always started with the Mormons, damning old Brigham Young for making this war necessary and for marrying so many wives. Then he damned the plural wives for marrying Brigham Young, and Daniel Wells for sending men out to burn the prairie and bothering the United States Army. Then he'd curse Porter Rockwell, Lot Smith, and Bill Hickam for carrying out the orders. Sometimes the sergeant would even curse the Army for sending him boys instead of men to drive his wagons and do his chores. He'd damn the Injuns, too, for making him worry so much that he couldn't get a good night's sleep. Sergeant Peabody sure was unhappy. I never seen him smile, not once. The way I looked at it, he should have been happy. He had a good job with the Army and a bunch of good mules and wagons to be around every day, and he got to see a war where nobody would shoot him because all he did was haul supplies. The Army gave him a good life, and he sounded so miserable like he just wanted to die. I warn't able to understand it. After a while, I quit trying. The Army finally caught up with us like Tom and Sergeant Peabody said it would. It bring with it a bunch more wagons, cannons on wheels, a gang of hungry-looking Injun guides, and about 70 soldiers mounted on fine Missouri horses. It was a sight just watching them catch up to us, but the most wonderful sight of all was at the end of the day when they would put up rows of sparkling white tents. They had a tent office for the officers, a tent for cooking where they cooked in a pot big enough to boil a whole hog, and they even had a tent where the men could drop their trousers and relieve themselves where nobody could see them. Them soldier boys made a beautiful city of white tents wherever we stopped, and they would take it down again the next morning. The boss of the soldiers was a boy who didn't look much older than me. They called him Captain Price. His first name was Hawk, but nobody called him that. It seemed strange to me that a man so young would be boss of all the others. Tom explained why. Captain Price had gone to a special school for soldiers called Point West. They made him a lieutenant the day he graduated, and 6 months later he was a captain. He had curly blonde hair, blue eyes, and there was no stubble on his face even when he didn't shave. Some of the men didn't like the idea of a boy giving them orders, but there warn't nothing they could do about it. One of the soldiers said Captain Price would start crying for his mama as soon as the Mormons started shooting at us. The only soldier younger than Captain Price was a bugle boy who warn't as old as me and Tom. He played beautiful music which told the soldiers what to do. He had a song he called Taps, which he played when it was time to go to bed, and another called Reveille, which he played when it was time to get up. He had 2 songs when it was time to eat, one for the men and another for the mules and horses. The boy played a special song when the soldiers was supposed to line up for roll call, another when the wagons was to start rolling, and another when it was time to stop. Tom told me they had a song when they was supposed to charge in and kill Mormons, and another to tell them to run away, but I never heard those songs. That bugle boy sure had a lot of songs to play, and I loved listening to every one of them, especially the one that told the horses and mules it was time to eat. The tame ones that we let out to graze because we knowed they would not run away. When they would hear that song, they would stampede up to the wagon where I was filling their feed bags, crowding around, snorting and whinnying, pawing the ground, happy as pigs in tubs of sour milk. The horses along the picket line made the same noises, every one of them looking at me with their big happy eyes. They could hardly wait until I slipped on their bags. They loved me, every last one of them, and I loved feeding them and listening to the bugle boy play the feeding song. I thought if I told the Army I was 18, maybe they would let me join up and do this the rest of my life. The horses and mules that got tied to the long picket lines got to eat the hay and grain we brung with us, hay at night, oats in the morning. The ones we let graze outside just got oats in the morning. In addition to taking care of the animals, we still had to stand our watches at night. It was our job to watch the mules and horses. Sergeant Peabody insisted Injuns was watching us all the time, just waiting for a chance to steal horses and mules. He said now we were getting closer to the war, there was a greater chance of Mormons trying to steal our horses too. He said any boy who fell asleep now might get hanged instead of whipped. When the soldiers joined up with us, we had extra work, but it was worth it because we got to eat with the soldiers. Me and the other boys were always last to eat because we had to take care of the horses first, but there was always plenty of food to fill us up. Beef, pork, beans, potatoes, carrots, biscuits with real butter and strawberry jam, boxes of apples and buckets of hot coffee with all the sugar and honey you wanted to put in it. I had never eaten so good, not even when I stayed with Tom's Aunt Polly. While I was loving the food, Tom was always looking for soldiers to talk to. They tells him they hopes to kill lots of Mormons and how happy they is to get paid to do it. They gets to see the West, too. Some talks about going to California to find gold and get free land when they gets out of the Army. While Tom is talking to the soldiers, I usually takes my food with me to the cook tent where I can talk to Jim. He's not very happy. He says if he didn't think the soldiers would come after him, he'd run away and go back to Blue Fox's camp. I just couldn't understand why he would want to be around a killer like Blue Fox. Jim tried to explain. "Them Injuns nicer to old Jim than any white massa ever wore, 'cept Huck Finn," he says. "Them Injuns talks to old Jim like I's a man, not a nigger. Even the squaws, especially that one you seed with me. Being with that lady beats cooking for a gang of white boys. Jim go back after Mormons kill soldier boys." I didn't know what to say back to Jim, so I just listens and keeps my mouth shut. I think it is interesting that he calls a squaw a lady. I never heard anybody call a squaw a lady before. The only lady I knows out in this wilderness is called Peggy. Jim sees the Injuns different than me and Tom in the Army sees them. Before long, Tom is so excited he can't think of nothing to do except lie about his age and join the Army so he can get one of them blue shirts, a new rifle with a sword that screws on the end so you can stab folks when you don't have time to put in more powder and lead. Tom says, "They feeds you like a king, lets you sleep in a new tent, gives you a fancy horse and saddle, and pays you to shoot Mormons, Injuns, and maybe some Mexicans, too." The way he says it, I wonder if he believes that Mexicans and Mormons is people, too, who have got mothers who cry themselves nearly to death when their boys get shot. If Tom knows it, he don't care even a little. I told Tom that if I wanted to join the Army, I wouldn't have to lie about my age because I don't know how old I was. If a boy needed to be 18 to join, then I would say I was 18, and I wouldn't be lying because I don't know how old I really am. Might as well be 18 as any other age. Tom wanted me to join up right now, but I told him it would have to wait until after I found Peggy and set her free. "And how will you do that?" he asks. "Don't know," I says. "The trappers said something about going to Fort Bridger. If I go there and sniff around, somebody might have seen him. Then I'll figure out how to save her." I can tell by the twist in his mouth that Tom still thinks I'm crazy for thinking Peggy is worth saving. "Mary warn't married to Joseph when she had Jesus," I says, thinking I'd heard something like that one time when I went to church with Aunt Polly. "And nobody's wanting to toss her out with the bath water. Mary was a virgin." "Then so is Peggy," I says. "You don't even know what it means," Tom says, sounding so high and mighty that I want to punch him. Instead, I just tells him how I feels inside. When folks says Mary's a virgin, they say it like she's real special. That's how I sees Peggy, so I guess I'll just call her my Virgin Peggy, and if you don't care for that, we can just step outside and see. I rolls my fingers into a fist. Tom kinda backs away. He don't want no fight, but he don't believe what I says either. We just stops talking about it, and after that we don't talk about Peggy much at all. But I think about her a lot, being with them trappers and all, thinking she'd be locked in by promises she made to save Flaxie and me. I figure the time will come when she will have to break them promises, even if it means me killing them trappers. They deserve it for sending me out naked on the prairie to die. They'll be sorry. I'd see to it. By this time my wages had paid for my new clothes, and I was saving every quarter, hoping to buy me a rifle, knife, and maybe even a horse or mule when we gets to Fort Bridger. That's when I reckon I'll leave my work with Sergeant Peabody and go after Peggy. In the meantime, we was getting closer to Fort Bridger every day. The army food and hard work was putting new muscles on my skinny body. I was feeling good and getting stronger every day. We is following the Sweetwater River now, instead of the North Platte, and some days we pass wagon trains, mostly families heading for Oregon or California. Some of their wagons are pulled by ox teams which walk real slow, so we just go right on around them, waving to the folks who is driving the teams or walking along on the ground. Sometimes one of the boys will ride over on a horse and talk for a while. I thinks of Mr. and Mrs. Mills and their fine, strapping boys, and how Blue Fox killed them all, and hope these families will have a safer journey. And I think they will because there are so many of them in large bunches, and there's so many soldiers on the road that I think the Injuns are too scared now to kill folks, though they might steal a horse or two. One day we seen a wagon train very different from all the rest. The wagons were real little and had only two wheels, one on the right and one on the left. Instead of being pulled by mules or oxen, they was pulled by people, mostly men, but sometimes the older boys and big girls was pulling them too. Tom said they were Mormons, too poor to own mules and oxen, going to Great Salt Lake City. The little wagons they called hand carts. Many of the hand cart pioneers had froze to death in winter storms the year before near the headwaters of the Sweetwater. When some of the Mormons saw us staring at them, they waved at us. Sergeant Peabody yelled back at them, telling them to go straight to hell and to stay away from our wagons. He yelled at them that if they saw us coming back from Salt Lake in a few weeks, they should come over and he would show them Brigham Young's scalp. Then he laughed real loud and squirted a big stream of tobacco juice towards them. That same evening, finishing my chores early, I wandered over to the cook tent to see Jim while he helped fix supper. He was sitting on a box, cleaning potatoes and throwing them into a big wash tub on the ground. There was a pile of boxes behind where he was sitting, and some big barrels on the other side of the wash tub where he was throwing the potatoes. I found me a place to sit on one of the barrels. Jim is still not very happy about the soldiers taking him from the Injun camp. We are just sitting there, talking about nothing in particular, when Sergeant Peabody comes along, looking mad as ever, his eyes on the ground, chewing on a big wad, mumbling something about the damn Mormons. It just so happens with them barrels on his right and the boxes on his left, old Jim is blocking the way to get through. So Sergeant Peabody orders Jim to get off his black ass and clear a path. I look at Jim, expecting him to jump up and get out of the way, as all good slaves is supposed to do. But he don't do it. He just keeps cleaning spuds, looking down at his work. Peabody stops. I see his face turning red, and he is chewing as fast as I ever seen him chew on a very big wad. He calls Jim a black turd and to get the hell out of the way. Jim just keeps cleaning spuds like he don't even hear, but I know he hears every word, and I know there's going to be big trouble real fast. I jumps down from my barrel and starts backing away. I think Sergeant Peabody is getting ready to kick old Jim right off that box. Instead, I see the sergeant's mouth pucker up as he pushes all the juice he can find to the front of his mouth. Then he squirts a brown stream right at the side of Jim's face. But Jim ain't just looking at spuds. He sees it a-comin', so he moves his head at the last minute. The brown stream goes into the wash tub where he has been throwing the potatoes. Peabody's right boot shoots forward, aimed at Jim's ribs, but the sergeant is too slow. Jim grabs the boot as he explodes out of his crouch, forcing the sergeant to fall over backwards. Jim is on top of him, fists flying, smashing into the sergeant's face and ribs. Peabody starts yelling. Other soldiers yell back. Pretty soon 5 or 6 soldiers are jumping on top of Jim and wrestling him away from the sergeant. In a minute they are holding Jim on the ground, and he ain't trying to get up no more. Peabody gets up, holding his jaw with one hand and brushing dirt off his clothes with the other. His mean eyes are on Jim. I am so surprised at what Jim has done. It ain't like a peaceful old slave with a tender heart like Jim's to stand up to a mean white man. A slave would likely get killed for what he just done. He should have said yes, sir, and jumped out of the way like he always done before when things like this came along. I didn't reckon being free would change a gentle human being like Jim, but it had. If old Miss Watson handed him her chamber pot today and told him to wash it out, this new Jim might just look her straight in the eye and tell her to do it herself. I wondered if all those abolitionists knowed what they was getting into by wanting to set free all them nice friendly slaves. I said I was surprised at Jim, but I was also glad he showed some pluck. Peabody was a mean man. A boy had no choice but to let him be mean. But a strong man like Jim didn't have to take it, even if his skin was black and he had been a slave. When he was a slave, Jim was a good man, but now he was a strong man, too. Being free had done that, I reckon. This story is continued on Disc 4.